want the BBC leaning this way or that way. I just want it straight and impartial and fair.
In her resignation statement, Deborah Turner said that the recent allegations that the BBC News is institutionally biased are wrong. Do you think the BBC is institutionally biased?
No, I don't, and I'm sure someone's going to correct me pretty quickly if I'm wrong, but I just reread the memo yet again outside the door here. I don't think I used that phrase anywhere in the memo, and I do not think it's institutionally biased. Let's be very clear. Tons of stuff the BBC does is world-class, both factual programming and non-factual programming. I was a political correspondent at the Daily Mirror, Sunday Times, other places for 14 years. I think the standard of BBC Westminster is exemplary. And that's why I keep saying these were incipient problems. We were finding the odd problem here, the odd problem there. And the crucial thing was, when I say odd problem here and there, every single thing we spotted, as per my memo, seemed to me to have systemic causes. And the root of my disagreement and slight concern even today is that the BBC was not, and I hope they will change, but will they, treating these as having systemic causes. There's real work that needs to be done at the BBC.
Do you think that the failings that you highlighted were serious enough to require the resignation of the DG and the head of news?
Not if they had a plan to get on top of things and treat these things as systemic problems. I mean, look, I'm keenly aware. I don't want to come before you sounding like I'm some sort of pompous figure, right? It's not necessarily for me, humble old me, to tell the Director General of the BBC exactly how to do his job. But you've asked me a straight question. I would have hoped they'd get on top of these problems, start sorting them out in a systemic and more methodical way, and everything would have been fine.
What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, my experience was that the BBC took issues of impartiality extremely seriously. We've all heard Tim Davie put impartiality at the centre of his time as Director General. In the 3 years I was involved with the BBC, and prior to that with the Sirota Review, I felt it was a continuous process, an active debate. These are dynamic issues. They're very complicated issues often of impartiality. They're decided in the context of individual programmes on a daily basis across thousands of hours of coverage. So there was a healthy debate. I mean, you've heard from Michael, we can, in the EGSC, it was a healthy debate and often a very robust debate about some of these issues. But in my view, was the BBC willing to have a proper conversation, debate, and actually take action? In my view, yes, they were.
Thank you.
Thanks. Before we get into the a little more about the issues arising in the memo, can we talk a little bit about the role of the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee? You're here obviously as external advisors to it. Can you just talk about the purpose of it, how each of you were recruited and appointed to it?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Caroline?
I can go first if you like, Jeff. So I got involved with the BBC first of all via the Nick Sirota Review. I spent 20 years in journalism, most of it at the Financial Times, but also at the New Statesman and the Economist magazine. The BBC really matters to me. As an institution, I think it's extremely important, and as Michael said, particularly in the era of AI, when I spent a lot of time on AI, when 52% of the internet is supposed to be generative AI generated, I think it's an extraordinarily important institution to get this right. I worked on the Nick Sirota Review for about 6 months. It was a significant review. And then when the opportunity came up to become an editorial advisor to the committee, I was very keen to help enforce what we'd found in the Sirota Review. There are multiple recommendations in the Sirota Review, which I can walk through, but at a high level, one did include having broader editorial advisors on the committee. And that's what led to us being appointed. Part of that was led by Ofcom, who wanted to expand the range of editorial opinion available to the BBC. The second thing which came out of the Sirota Review, which was a key part of our implementation and actually the day-to-day work in the committee, was the introduction of new thematic reviews. These are really significant pieces of work. They took many months of work. They were usually hundreds of interviews behind them, and they were very comprehensive reviews of impartiality and BBC coverage. So we looked at immigration, for example, on the committee. They looked at the role of coverage of the economy. These were very important pieces of work, and I think they are comprehensive and extremely detailed. And they were ongoing. Alongside that, there were independent reviews of programmes, there was monitoring of impartiality, there were new guidelines initiated in terms of training. So if I sort of give that's a quick sketch, there are many other, I think we had 39 recommendations from the Sirota Review in the end that we were involved in implementing on behalf of the committee. So a lot of the work in the first 2 years was very much implementing the Sirota Review and the outcomes.
That's a fantastic run-through by Caroline. I'm not sure, is there any bit of your question you think is unaddressed that I can actually add value with?
Well, I suppose, am I right to read into what Caroline said then, that you're looking, in terms of these thematic reviews, you're not just looking at things that have gone wrong, the committee, you're looking at future challenges, proactive kind of looking ahead?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that first. So one of the key tasks of the committee is future editorial risks. So, I mean, Michael's account gives a personal view of what was of issues on the committee for him. One of the issues I was particularly interested in, and really important obviously, is the role of AI. And is the BBC embracing AI, thinking about it appropriately? And in an era of fake news, it's even more important. So we did have reviews of looking at the role of AI at the BBC. When I left the BBC in the role, one of the issues I spoke to Chris Saul about was how far are we making sure the committee continues to have enough time for really deep dives into future editorial risks. Much longer sessions on some of those issues I think would be really welcome.
So, again, Caroline summarised it fantastically. These thematic reviews, to your point, so they are proactive. They're not waiting for an obvious thing to go wrong, or was that quite right? Which was the case with a lot of things in my memo. But even on the thematic reviews, you see, my disagreement with the BBC is about the thoroughness with which it takes action and follows things through in this area of editorial standards. So if you take one of the thematic reviews, I think it may have been the first one, which was on tax and spend. How does the BBC cover issues to do with the economy, government tax spending, and so on? And there were a number of recommendations from that. One of them being, for example, that it should become routine that if someone is on a News Current Affairs show and says we need more money spent on X, then they should be challenged, well, that's fine, what's the trade-off? Do you want tax to go up, whatever? That was one of many, but a very simple to understand recommendation from that review. And I remember when the conclusions came before the committee, I think it was my first or second meeting, I asked what the follow-up was going to be. For example, because at that stage I didn't know the ins and outs of how every bit of the BBC worked. So I said, after each news show or current affairs show, will there be a tick list? Were people challenged in accordance with these new recommendations? And I was pretty much told, look, don't worry about it. Everyone knows this report. Everyone in the BBC's read it. Everyone takes it very seriously. Now, one way and another, because partly because of my long, years ago as a journalist for 20 years, I know all sorts of people in the BBC, from a junior sub-editor I worked with in the 1980s to very senior people. Not one person I spoke to had read the report. Very few were aware of it. And later on, when we got follow-up reports, they did not give a gold star 10 out of 10 for implementation. So every step of the way, I'm afraid, I feel the BBC fell short on thoroughness when it came through to implementation.
And to what extent is that the fault of the committee? You talked about there are systemic causes and systemic problems. Is that where do they lie?
I think, I'm afraid to say this, ultimately with management. The Standards Committee has got independent advisors, Caroline, myself. It's got non-executive members. I do give credit to the management, by the way, and this may sound a trivial point, I was always impressed with it. These would be meetings that would go on 2-3 hours. The Director General, Head of News, Deputy Director of News always made time, fully attended, paid full attention. But to your question, I don't think it was the committee that was at fault. I think there's simply something. The BBC, I just think, had a bit of a blind spot when it came to following through as methodically as I appreciate I'm only one individual, but as I thought they should.
Is that the fault of individuals, though? You talked about systemic, but it sounds like you're putting the blame on individuals for not following through.
Well, I don't know whether it's a management culture thing or an excess of faith in how things will be implemented down at programme editor level, but to get to the answer to that, that's exactly the kind of thing I'd like them to look into, by the way. I mean, you're almost borderline now talking about these systemic faults that I'm so obsessed about. I think they needed to look at why the implementation was not better.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I just ask Caroline, Michael writes in his memo that he found Jonathan Munro and Deborah Turnus quite defensive when issues were raised. Did you?
I think the BBC is the most scrutinised media organisation in the country. From my experience at the Financial Times, it was a very different level of public scrutiny. It's scrutinised obviously by this committee, by members of the public, by editorial complaints, by its audience. And obviously there are many ways to make a complaint to the BBC. But in my experience, are there times when they're necessarily defensive on some issues in that context? Yes. But as a broad sort of characterisation, I would say I did not find the BBC to be defensive. I found the BBC to be actively engaged in discussions about how to improve issues of partiality on very complicated subjects. And this is a live, dynamic debate when the context changes all the time. It's very hard. It's not one and done. This is obviously a live debate. I think there can be differences of opinion about whether the BBC went far enough on some of the issues that were raised in the committee. And some of the issues that were raised were significant issues. But actually what's important is that the BBC were raising them themselves. They were coming up via the EGSC commissioning research from David Grossman to help facilitate that robust debate and that review of impartiality.
And in terms of the EGSC, I'm keen to sort of get a little bit of a flick. I mean, in effect, you guys had this unique opportunity to be almost a fly on the wall of how this committee is working as independent advisors to it. So you could just give us a flavour, how were decisions reached? Would you say that there was a degree of camaraderie and common purpose when it came to the pursuit of impartiality and journalistic integrity on the EGSC?
I'm happy to answer that first.
Yeah.
I found it to be an active debate in the committee. I mean, you'll hear from Robbie and your next panel. He's robust in how he expresses his opinion and wants the BBC to do well. So I found there were a lot of issues that we covered in the committee. I mean, Michael's given an account of some of the issues, but actually most of the committee was involved in looking at things like editorial complaints, monitoring impartiality across the BBC, looking at reviews of the BBC, thinking ahead about issues that were coming up. There was a broad range of issues that we debated on the committee, so it wasn't always a contested space, but there were areas of the committee when there were significant issues to be discussed. And obviously you've seen some of the research from David Grossman, which is in Michael's report, and of course that led to an important discussion. But I would say each time the executive team would come back and then debate those issues with us. And ultimately, we were both advisors to the committee, and it was obviously for the committee itself, which were the 4 board members, to sort of work out what significant action should be taken next.
What you've just said, it sounds like some of the committee members were more vocal than others, or more dominant in the conversation.
I wouldn't agree. I think it was a very open committee. People could say what they thought.
And the EGSC has been politicised in the way that it came to some of these decisions. In this morning's Guardian, it suggests that all members came from a certain political viewpoint. Is that your experience?
I wouldn't be my characterisation of how the committee worked now.
And I endorse everything Caroline says. Most of it was great. They were very respectful, open discussions. I think I'd have to check this. Most of the decisions that were taken were unanimous. So, I mean, I know there's some people saying this is a weird tick list that Prescott's come up with in his memo, but my memo simply quotes extensively internal BBC reports. I think maybe with 1 or 1.5 exceptions. They were all commissioned by the full committee. There was an awful lot of consensus. The one area, I hope I don't end up being a broken record, but the one area where there was not consensus was particularly those reports by David Grossman, fabulous, very professional ex-Newsnight reporter. The reports he was coming through with, so many of them quoted in my memo, there was not unanimity in how to respond to those. Clearly, you can see it in the memo. But other than that, I would totally endorse what Caroline says.
And there was no one member of that committee that was more dominant than the other?
No. I don't think so. Anyway, that's never my impression.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prescott, you've just said that the BBC is not institutionally biased. What is your bias, if you have one?
Well, it's always a tough job, isn't it, spotting your own biases? I mean, when you read about these centrist dads, I think I'm a centrist dad. That would probably cover it. I mean, actually, to that question, there are a lot of people. I know you folks haven't gone here so far, but there's been a lot of stuff in some of the papers about Robbie Gibb, and the chair was asking, was one personality more dominant than another? You're asking about my preferences. I am no ideological soulmate of Robbie Gibb, for example. I'm a centrist dad.
I'm a centrist dad too, but a company that you work for received over £100,000 from Larry Ellison, a Republican mega donor. You'll be aware that Donald Trump has removed funding from a lot of public service broadcasters. Is it true that you actually want the BBC to be impartial?
Yes.
Based on those affiliations?
It's totally true. Yes, of course it is.
You said there's some real work to be done at the BBC. Along what lines? Do you think any of that work should be done at the boardroom level?
I think it's a job for the executive, overseen by bodies like the board and the Standards Committee. And if I give you an example, it might help explain what I mean. One of my sadnesses was that when this thing did leak into the public domain, that so much focus, I do understand why, but so much of the focus went on to Trump panorama, okay? But for me, the most heartfelt, the thing I felt most passionately about was the BBC put out one day, over 12 hours, on all its bulletins, a story saying that ethnic minority people in this country were being charged more for their insurance purely because of their ethnicity. And when David Grossman looked into this, he found the story to be utterly untrue. I mean, so it was a dreadful thing to have put out, particularly given, it's wrong. It must have been deeply upsetting for many people out there, particularly ethnic minority people who heard that story all day long. Anyway, it was untrue. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, how could the BBC get this so wrong? Who had the idea of doing this story? Who conceived of it? Who did the initial research? Who did the initial reporting? Who wrote the script? Which editors cleared it across the whole of the BBC all day? A completely untrue report. There were multiple levels of editorial failure. Now, we never got a good accounting for that at the Standards Committee, and I would have expected, with a better culture when it came to these things, a complete look at every single failure and ideas for correction. I said many times at the committee meetings that things would come up, many of them in my memo, and I said, to me, this makes me worry about recruitment, about training, about professional standards, about the systems, about the processes. The BBC, I know in the chairman's memo, he tries to say, oh, all this stuff is old. We dealt with it all. Well, to me, what I was frequently seeing was that the BBC's idea of dealing with something was to change the editors around, tweak the written guidelines. But there was never, it seemed to me, any willingness, and take the story I've mentioned, to look into exactly what went wrong there and whether there were deep implications. And of course, since the memo came out, you've had people like Mark Irwin, very respected, former BBC correspondent. He's done a piece on Substack. I don't know if you've read it. It's worth reading, where he seems to sort of, he's not criticising my memo, far from it, but he says he thinks that there are issues like this in the BBC, and there are deep cultural forces at play here. So there's a lot for them to look at.
You mentioned the memo a few times. You also told us that you'd sent it to Ofcom, DCMS, and you'd had that meeting with the BBC. 2 weeks later, the Telegraph had that memo, and they said that it was circulating around government departments. Do you have any idea how that memo got to those other departments or the Daily Telegraph?
No, absolutely not. All that I know is what I've stated.
Did you share that memo with anybody else beyond the BBC board?
Absolutely
and those
not.
committees?
Well, sorry, Ofcom and DCMS, but beyond that, no.
So somewhere there's a leak. Any idea where that might be?
The case. No, I have no idea.
Thank you, Chair.
Did you work with anyone else when you prepared your memo?
No, it was all my own work.
Natasha.
Thanks very much for coming in today. So, Caroline, you mentioned the Sorority Review and talked about the depth of work that was involved in that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. The review did find a culture of defensiveness at the BBC, especially around admitting mistakes, as the Chair sort of mentioned, and that was in 2021. Have things improved?
I think they have improved. I think we can point to things like Tim Davie on Glastonbury. I think that was a speedy apology, and rightly so. I think there are probably many other examples of where the BBC has apologised in the last few years. But I would say, I think the real issue is the culture of the BBC in terms of the level of attention paid to these issues. And again, in my view, the fact that we had a robust committee to debate issues of impartiality. The fact that we had David Grossman being commissioned by the GSE to ask questions about the BBC's coverage in order to help inform future coverage was actually really significant. I think there are a few organisations when you actually have that level of auditing internally on a regular basis, and this is an ongoing issue. This is not one and done in terms of managing these issues.
You kind of mentioned Tim Davies' sort of robust and very quick response to Glastonbury. Do you have any ideas as to why the kind of robust and quick response didn't come this time round?
I wasn't involved in the issues with the board, so I'm afraid I wasn't privy to discussions, and I didn't know that Michael had sent the report until I read about it in the newspaper.
Why there was a bit more of a delay over sort of a robust and response to
when my memo had leaked?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I only know what, same as you, what I was reading in the newspaper. Sorry.
Fair enough. And then just on the sorority review again. So, how has this changed the working practice and culture practically at the BBC? We keep coming back to this thing of culture and transparency. Well, how has it actually changed anything?
I'll give a few examples. So, first of all, there are internal programme reviews which were reported on to the EGSC. So if there were particular issues with the programme, that they all led internally, we were given a high-level view of whether the programme was performing well or not performing well and some of the outcomes of those reviews. That's frustrating and difficult for programme makers to have an additional level of insight in terms of what's happening, to be asked questions. I think that's important. The thematic reviews are significant pieces of work. I point to the immigration review. I think it was a substantial piece of work by Madeleine Thomson. And in fact, Madeleine continued to be involved with the BBC for another year, advising the BBC, going around the region, speaking about immigration, better ways to cover it, asking questions. It was a very thorough process of her and her team continuing to act on behalf of the BBC, give recommendations and advice, and being available as a resource on issues of immigration and how well to cover it, which is a challenging issue. So I would say, in terms of specific practical impacts, those are two good examples. I think a third is performance reviews. So again, we understood that impartiality was becoming a big issue in terms of being, frankly, played into how people were being judged in terms of being good editors of programmes. So again, it was an issue in terms of impartiality was embedded into sort of a new performance culture. Could there be improvements? Yes, and I have a few ideas on things which might continue to be improved, but I do think it had an impact. And they also had a lot of focus on training. Not surprisingly, you have lots of people coming in and out of the BBC. People who are outside the BBC also had to do the editorial training. So I think across a number of areas, I would say there was a systematic change in terms of what we were doing on the committee and what we were seeing.
But how do we then kind of get in the position that we're in now, where, you know, Michael, you felt compelled to write your memo? Is there an issue around transparency at the BBC? Is there an issue with just being transparent and honest about when things go wrong?
I think there kind of is when it comes to self-criticism, actually. I just think that Caroline's described the processes very well, and the BBC does try to look at itself, and it's done a lot of the right things and a lot of responsible things. But I just think that then when it comes to following through on actions, it's not always fantastic, and you do get levels of denial, as per my memo. Whether it was the issues in covering the US presidential race or Israel, Gaza or whatever, you got these reports through from David Grossman, and the management's response was to just plain deny. So, well, we don't agree with them. And what was the rationale? Did they outright find David Grossman was wrong on the facts or out-argue his rationale? No, they just disagreed with them and didn't do anything.
To what extent do you think there's an issue with the comms of the BBC? I mean, it feels like there's some kind of muscle memory of how to mishandle allegations of editorial mishaps and mistakes. Is there a problem with their communication? Because, you know, quite often you get a very defensive, very short statement that comes out in the initial period, and then a bit more sort of self-reflection and self-flagellation a bit further down the line. But to what extent is that just my perception?
Well, it's a mighty big organisation, isn't it? And, you know, sometimes it is difficult to check out all the facts internally and make the most powerful statement that you can. I think it's more to do with what I suspect are some cultural forces at work in the BBC I think, even as I sit here before you now, I just don't think the BBC's been very willing to look at things through that prism.
You feel that there's a culture endemic in the BBC?
I think there could be. No, I certainly do not claim to be an expert on this, and I already commended to the committee this piece by Mark Urban, who spent many, I think, decades probably in the BBC, and there are others. But the things we were seeing and the management reaction to some of the issues that I outline in my memo make me fear that that could be a component of what is going wrong. And that's why, you know, at the start of this meeting I kept referring to incipient problems, right? I don't think this is catastrophic yet, but I do think that it seemed that things were getting worse. That was my honest perspective, and I think it's hopefully reflected there in the memo that you'll have read.
To what extent do you think it's that which undermines people's trust in the BBC?
Well, trust in the BBC is a big subject, isn't it? I mean, it's not even all party political. You've got a, you know, urban, rural bias, possibly a London focus, London values versus values outside of the capital. I mean, it's a lot there.
You wish to expand?
On trust in the BBC. Well, I suppose simply, and this is kind of what my memo is about. I think the public expect the BBC to be honest, accurate, impartial, fair. It is most of the times. It needs to do a better job when it's caught out not being so.
Would you say Would you say it was defensive? Would you say one of its headlines would be that the BBC is defensive?
Yes, I would. So, for example, another thing, I'm not being boring, continually referring back to this memo, but look, another thing in my memo was that there's this strange episode where a group of Oxbridge historians calling themselves History Reclaimed said, look, every time there's this, not every time, I think they sample 4 or 5 programmes, but they said it's curious, because it was a carefully written report, they didn't overclaim. They were honest about the limited number of shows they'd watched. And they said, we do seem to notice a tendency that in all these shows, instead of getting the foremost historical expert in the field, they're getting people who are far more inexpert, and our suspicion is it's because they're giving them controversial quotes rather than the best take you could possibly get. And the BBC's, and as per my report, I thought this was interesting and should be looked into, because History Reclaimed also had a very simple fix, which was, could the BBC have another look at who they were inviting in from the field of historians to comment on things? That was it. Would the BBC listen? No. And in fact, there were then formal complaints from, I'm guessing, from readers who'd seen that report, based on the report, and the BBC rejected them all and accused History Reclaimed of cherry picking in a very snotty fashion. Well, History Reclaimed didn't claim to be doing more than that. They said, we've watched 4 or 5 problems, might be a problem here, could you take a look at it? The answer was, formal findings, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, we're not talking to you. Extraordinary.
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
I'm sorry?
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
Not institutionally, no. I think it's more... Look, when you run a big outfit like that, you'll all appreciate this, you've got to maintain staff morale, and the management have to be seen to be defending their own folks. And believe it or not, even after that memo, I totally get that. But they get a little bit wrong, and I think that was an instance, and there are other instances in the memo.
Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Prescott, do you think that the BBC is in a better place for the 3 resignations? Do you think public trust should be greater or lower for those 3 resignations?
Ooh. It's very hard to answer, because I think the answer to that depends on each individual citizen's perception of what's gone on.
You speak of culture,
yeah,
which starts from the top, does it not?
Yeah. Usually, yes. So, and you want to know bluntly whether I think it's better or worse for not having Tim Davie and the rest of them there, I guess. Well, look, let me answer this way. For what, I took no pleasure in those people feeling compelled to leave their jobs, number one. And as regards particularly Tim Davie, for what little use or worth this is to him now, firstly, I always liked the guy. And secondly, most importantly, to the extent that inexpert me can judge, he seemed to me to be doing a first-rate job across 80 or 90% of the portfolio. It was just that he had this blind spot on editorial failings. I think it's a bit of a tragedy he's gone. I thought he was a supreme talent, but he had this blind spot.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Michael, Were you pleased that your memo found its way into the
No, gosh.
You're surprised?
As I say, yeah, I was surprised. And first I was surprised. Secondly, as I think I said a little while ago, I was hoping this might be sorted out quietly, board, Ofcom, DCMS. So that's one thing. Second thing is, again, I kind of alluded to this, given what, believe it or not, I was hoping this memo would do good and result in a better BBC being quietly achieved. And the fact it was in the Telegraph, no, I'm not criticising the Telegraph. I mean, they gave a lot of space, they took it very seriously. But in sort of ideological terms, the Telegraph appeals to a certain bit of the spectrum. And I think, therefore, the fact they broke the story became a bit of a barrier to people elsewhere on the political spectrum taking this as seriously or thinking this really was as straightforward as it seems. So that's my answer.
And in terms of the comment that you just made about Tim Davie having a bit of a blind spot in an editorial sense, to what extent do you think that is simply because of the fact that that DG job is just too big for one person?
I've been thinking for a while that it is, and what's happened to Tim confirms that. So again, look, I'm not here to claim I'm the biggest expert in the world on organisational design, but as you asked me, and I was an advisor to this committee, it seems to me, I think the BBC might be well advised to consider having an editor-in-chief on the one hand and a CEO on the other. Yeah. And I very well remember the period in the 80s when they did try that, and John Burt was at first not, in charge of the whole of the enterprise. They did split the role, and I think it's probably worth looking at that again.
Do you have a view on that, Caroline?
On Tim Davie, sorry.
On splitting the role.
Splitting the role. My role was an editorial advisor to the EGSC. I think the issues of whether the overall structure of the BBC and the governance for Tim versus the role is obviously for this committee and for the BBC board itself. It is a very large role and a very complicated role and very hard to get right consistently. And I think in previous times we've had a deputy director general of the BBC, and I think probably it's such a large role and a lot of issues that I think that might benefit from it.
Is that how you'd rather see it split, a DG and a deputy DG, or would you rather, as Michael suggests, have an editor-in-chief alongside a DG?
I don't really have a perspective on it. I mean, I have a personal view as an average person looking at this, but I don't believe...
What's your personal view?
I think my personal view is what I've just said, is I think would be helpful to have, it's a large job with a lot of responsibilities, and it's an important institution to get this right.
And were you wanting to come in?
Thanks, Chair. One more, Mr. Prescott. You spoke quite highly of Tim Davie. What was your relationship with, excuse if the mispronunciation that is oncoming, Shamit Banerjee? Did you have a relationship with him?
No, I don't know the individual, no. Okay.
I think you can, but let's move on to Vicky, please.
You rightly pointed out that the Panorama programme has been picked up quite a lot in terms of your note. And this was discussed at 2 meetings of the EGSC in January and May. Yeah. Why do you think that the EGSC failed to act satisfactorily at either meeting?
Well, at the first meeting, so if I, probably the best way to answer that, and it'll certainly help me give you a good answer, is if I go through the chronology. So I happened to be at home and I watched that Panorama. It struck me as having issues to do with balance. I didn't think it was quite what I might have expected. I still wasn't too bothered because I thought, that's quite an anti-Trump programme, but they'll probably be just as hard on Kamala Harris next week, and they weren't. So I mentioned this at the committee. David Grossman was asked to look into it all, and he came back in January with the findings, which are summarised in my memo. The BBC executive did not seem, how shall I put it, they did not seem very open to accepting what David was saying, and so they were asked, and they agreed. As I say, there was usually consensus on the committee. They very happily agreed to go away and come back with a written response, having, to the mind certainly of me and recollection of me, and I suspect others, seemed to be not open to accepting what David was saying, even though his findings were so stark. So they did come back in May with this written response. Again, parts of the written response are quoted in my memo, and it was black and white. The management did not accept there was a problem either overall with the US presidential coverage or with the Panorama programme. Simple as that.
Just on that, can I just... sorry, Vicky. The Grossman report says that generally speaking, the coverage of the election issues was generally excellent.
Yeah, so I hope I've been clear. What I'm focusing on incipient problems that need addressing, and in my memo you'll see, because I was trying to summarise it all for the board of the BBC, I think it's 7 points or something, kicking off with they ignored or broke their own guidelines on use of opinion polling. So there was a lot to the Grossman report. And actually, do you know, it's good you've mentioned that, because that kind of gives you the context. That was very much the BBC management's view. It was great. They were excellent. On page 3, David Grossman's report says it was all excellent. Well, there was a lot to praise. And by the way, I've been a reporter. I hope the BBC Washington staff don't think I'm sitting here getting at them. I know they're doing tough jobs, okay? But David Grossman did not give it an absolute gold star. There are a lot of issues, as summarised in my memo. And so, I don't know, hopefully does that cover...
Well, I mean, I think there could be an accusation that you didn't represent the Grossman report fairly in your memo, and that whereas you picked up all the points that you made that were criticisms of the BBC without stating the context, which generally speaking he was positive about the coverage and had put forward these particular problems as issues that needed to be corrected for next time.
Well, look, David Grossman would have to speak for himself. My take was firstly that he was being polite. Secondly, there were a lot of very specific instances in the full report, summarised in the memo, of things that had gone wrong. And you know, that both my memo to the board, its intent, remember, this was conceived as a private memo to 14 people, and it was meant to be a call to action. So it was not, I didn't put in the stuff for celebration. It was very deliberately highlighting problems and faults that I felt were not being addressed properly.
Back to the Panorama documentary. So you said that you watched it on the 6th of January and that was the point.
I think it was the show, I think, was... sorry to interrupt you. It was just before the presidential race. I think it was late October. But sorry to interrupt.
So you watched it, and then that is what prompted you to put in complaints, even though there was no complaints about the Panorama documentary.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterise it as a complaint. That's not really how the Standards Committee worked. So I watched the show, okay, and even after watching it, although I thought, a lot more anti-Trump witnesses than pro-Trump and so on, I thought it was a bit of an anti-Trump programme. Didn't think it was fair balanced, as you might expect typically from the BBC. But even then, I wasn't too alarmed, because I just thought, and by the way, I rather enjoyed the programme. But I thought, they'll probably be doing just as aggressive a look at Kamala Harris next week. That's why this was so aggressive on Trump. And there wasn't a balancing programme. And so I can't remember now, I'd need to check whether I emailed David Grossman or raised it at the next committee meeting. But I simply said, could David have a look at the show to see what, because I could have been wrong, you know, that actually it was in line with the standards and it was all fair enough. And so that's how it wound up being looked at.
Then in terms of your memo, when did you include the Panorama programme into your memo? Well, was it at the start or later on?
No, my memo was all written of a piece. So although it begins with the example of Panorama, because I thought it was a very stark example of things, you know, the sorts of things that had gone wrong and were not being addressed. So that's why I nosed off the memo on it. But everything in the memo was written, you know, way after, because I left my last meeting of the Standards Committee was June, and it was in some months after, actually, before I started writing the memo.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Prescott, you mentioned that the January 6th documentary wasn't really of the editorial standard you expected, but that you thought that perhaps they'd be just as hard on Kamala Harris. Yeah. It has occurred to you, though, has it not, that Kamala Harris wasn't found by the January 6th committee to have played an active role in the Capitol riots?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. But
so what would such a documentary look like as a companion to the Donald Trump?
Well, the Trump Panorama was looking at his history as obviously he'd been president once already, his track record as a politician, and purported to be trying to look at the secret of his appeal. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, trying to look at what might the consequences be of him winning. You know, if he'd lost, he might have faced more lawsuits. If he won, he could crush them. You know, it's that sort of thing. So an equivalent look at Kamala Harris might be, well, what is the secret of her, what is her track record? What is the secret of her political appeal? What would the consequences be if she won? So it's pretty straight up and down, really. Or to me it seems so.
Thank you. Do you agree with Donald Trump's assertion that his reputation has been damaged by this documentary, considering, of course, that he was found to be a central figure in this insurrection, considering that he has been found by a civil court as being liable for sexual assault, that he's regularly boasted about sexual assault? Do you agree with Donald Trump that this documentary has harmed his image in some way?
If I could answer in two parts, as it were. Firstly, I'm supposing, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I should probably restrain myself a little bit, given that there is a potentially illegal action. All I can say is I can't think of anything I agree with Donald Trump on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks both. Very interesting. You've obviously got similar backgrounds in a way, Fleet Street and then the PR industry for a long time after that, but different conclusions as well. So fascinating. Thank you for both coming in. I just wondered, I think Jeff asked this earlier, so you were advising the EGSC. How did you hear about the job?
You want me to go first? Do you want to go first?
Just, I'm curious to know, probably a lot of our constituents would like to advise the BBC. Where does this get advertised? How did you hear about it?
I don't know. Can I beg your indulgence and give you what may be a longer answer?
A shorter one is probably better because, okay. I mean, just really want to know how you got the job, not a long anecdote. Just how did you hear of it?
I come from a working class background, son of immigrants. I got into Oxford from the local state school partly because of the excellence of public service broadcasting. I used to quote the shows in my essays. So I've been passionate about public service broadcasting for decades. I read every spit and cough about the BBC. I followed the Martin Bashir scandal. I saw that Nicholas Sirota did a review. Caroline was part of it. And I saw in the newspapers that one of the recommendations was to create this post. And I thought, what a fantastic job. I'd love to get that. So I looked out for the advert and I applied.
And it was advertised? Yeah, yes. Caroline, you said.
It was publicly advertised. Obviously, I was aware that they might create the role because it was one of the recommendations of the Sirota Review. And obviously, I was very interested in making sure the Sirota Review went somewhere. So I was very interested in making sure that the actions recommended by the Sirota Review were actually implemented. And I wanted to play a part in doing that.
Okay, yeah, no, just curious to know. And also, I guess the Grossman researcher role, I mean, he's not here, is he? Well, curious to know where these things are advertised. I've never seen those adverts.
Well, you're probably better directed at the chairman, because I don't know. It wasn't openly advertised, was it?
I think that's one.
I think it was an internal appointment, in effect, for a researcher, but you'd need to check with the Beeb.
Okay, I mean, look. Just you said to us, Michael, that I think you say in your memo as well that you've never been part of a political party. You're a centrist dad. You have no axe to grind. I think it says somewhere. Hang on. You do not hold any hard and fast views on matters such as American politics. But I mean, if you go through the memo, there are some quite interesting terms. Lawfare is one that's used by the MAGA generation. That's used as fact. And I think you critique the word reproductive rights, which is fairly common currency. We talk about it in this parliament. So, I mean, it does feel, and you've said also that there should have been a programme equally aggressive towards Kamala Harris. I mean, isn't this a weird sort of equivalence? Because Trump had a term as president. He had been found guilty of incitement. And we know that edit was wrong. That was very wrong. They should have indicated, like a ... you would in journalism, that these are two different parts of the speech. But, I mean, I don't know. There are some people making conclusions. If you look at the things in the dossier, what have we got here? We've got Trump defence. We've got trans. We've got Gaza. Are they not all from one sort of perspective, these comments?
Oh, gosh, thank you for the question. There's quite a lot there. On the selection of things that are in my memo and that David Grossman looked at, and you can check this with the BBC, I think there was only one that I suggested be looked at. So that menu that you're referring to and saying it was a curious selection, it was unanimous. Those topics for David to look at were unanimously agreed by the whole committee, so they're not mine. And when you mentioned, quoting lawfare and reproductive rights, I think I'm right here that those are words that appeared in David Grossman's reports. There's a lot of misapprehension. I'm not saying this is a view, but out there online, so on, there's a lot of misapprehension out there. In a funny way, a lot of my memo wasn't written by me. It was me quoting David Grossman's internal BBC reports. And he mentions I think it was him who made the point about lawfare, and it wasn't meant to be a party political or ideological point. He was making a very simple point that in America, unlike Britain, if you get a prosecuting counsel, they may be carrying a party political strike, they may be a political appointee, and that was important for audience understanding of the full context of the onslaught on Trump. Reproductive rights was in his American election report, where he was making the point that if correspondents use those terms as common parlance, there's a danger that you alienate part of the viewership who don't use that language. But this was all stuff these were not my views. These were all, me quoting from the internal BBC reports.
Caroline, isn't it the duty of all people on the board and the advisors to the board to represent all licence payers, and that's millions and millions of people? It just looks like these particular hobby horse culture war issues have been selected in one direction. I mean, surely your responsibility is to all licence fee payers.
Mind if I
and at the same time, we hear at the same time you two served your term, there was a letter from 400 BBC employees. There are the all-staff meetings. There was one just the week before last. There has been a letter we've been circulated by 100 eminent BBC folk, including Dimblebees and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So those are very different to the selectively picked examples here that all seem to betray a political bias themselves.
Yeah, I know. I've seen that point of view expressed online and so on.
Matthew Parris, if you look at him, you're giving us articles in The Spectator. His view of the Trump documentary, which I watched last night, 12 seconds within a 70-minute show. It was wrong, it was a bad edit, but I'm sure there's loads in there Trump would have liked. The MAGA superfans showing their adoration for him.
So this idea that there was a sort of ideological or party political skew to the work that was going on, I don't think it's actually entirely fair. And you've got to realise that when those reports were commissioned, we did not know what was going to come back. So if you take, for example, the BBC's coverage of US presidential elections, okay, when the committee asked David to look at this, he could have come back with a completely clean bill of health. It's possible.
He largely did.
Well, okay, hang on. It's possible, I suppose, to conceive that he might have come back saying, you know what, we were a bit unfair on Kamala Harris because Trump is so bombastic and says such outrageous things.
There's no equivalence there. Okay.
So you could. I'm just asking you. Obviously, you're very free to disagree, but it could have been Grossman came back and said, you know, we've been a bit unfair to Kamala Harris because Trump's so bombastic that we end up giving her too little airtime. That he might come back. As it happens, he did come back saying there was a skew against Trump's side, but we didn't know that's what his finding would be in advance. So I don't think it's entirely fair to suggest the committee had an ideological hue in commissioning the bits of work.
No, I'm saying the memo, not the committee.
Oh, the memo.
Because, you know, if you're saying you have to sling an equal amount of mud, surely the role of the journalist is to tell the truth.
Yeah, sure.
So do you have to find, do you know what I mean, just because tit-for-tat thing, because... Or do you tell
I certainly agree with what you say, both about you know, the truth and things being balanced. But the stuff in my memo, I think covers almost all of the David Grossman report. So it's not as if there were 100 reports and I picked these ones and they've got an ideological flavour to them. I've mentioned most of the reports that were done, and they were commissioned by always commissioned by the whole committee.
Sorry, Caroline.
I was going to say that looking at the overall debate we had in the committee, it was a long report, 20 pages, looking at US election coverage as a whole. And the whole point is to look at, are there areas of concern, bias, inaccuracies that might become a systemic issue and that we have to address going forwards. My view of that particular report was, I'm not saying it was a complete clean bill of health. There were issues that I think the BBC had to address, issues about how are we reporting appropriately in terms of individuals who are being quoted. Is the balance of geography of where the BBC was based in America and their operations appropriate and representative of kind of American coverage? And in fact, they realised that they probably needed to do more to change the balance of their geography across the thing. But actually, what I took away from that report is that there was actually very good coverage of the US elections, powerful coverage, and not quite perhaps the same. I have a difference of opinion about how important the concerns were around the US election coverage as a whole, and having read the David Grossman report.
And I'm just thinking of this memo, which has had such an effect, within a very short space of time. I think our committee's writing a thing before we've even seen the contents of the report, and within a week, 2 big heads have rolled, another one since. And some of these points you've claimed history reclaimed. I mean, if you look into who these people are, again, Robert Toombs, he's a well-known Brexit person. They're all from a particular slant. So I just wonder if you're aware of your own biases in the examples you've chosen. For example, you say that you should not state that the Trump election was stolen, that was baseless. Do you think that the idea that the Trump election was stolen was baseless?
No, I absolutely do not. I don't remember that bit of the memo.
Also, page 3, it says something like it was a Democrat majority committee.
Oh,
that he was found guilty of incitement.
That's right.
I mean, our committee is a majority Labour committee. We have a Conservative chair. Are you saying we're illegitimate?
No, of course, oh God, absolutely not. I'm a great respecter of Parliament and the traditions of Parliament. I spent 15 years as a correspondent here. Sorry, that bit that you're quoting, I know I've now got it. That was when the executive defended Panorama and was trying to argue there was no problem with the video splicing. One member of management prayed in aid the prosecution of Trump and the committee finding that you referred to. That's the only reference in there. But I do come back to this thing though. I'll deal with history reclaimed, because I suppose that was something I raised. It never led to a Grossman report, by the way. That was just one of my bugbears. But it's in my. But all the rest of the stuff, as I keep saying, this was not my tick list. These were reports commissioned by the entire committee for David Grossman to look into. We never knew what he would come back with. And if you take American presidential race, for example, he did come back saying, well, actually, was a little bit unbalanced. But we didn't know in advance he would say that. History reclaimed, I can tell you hand on heart, I never even Googled the historians behind it. I just got that they were Oxford.
Then, because they're not completely neutral people either, are they?
Yeah, but you've got to remember, all I was saying on the history reclaimed thing, which still seems to me a small thing, they seemed to me, from what I read in the papers, very reasonable. They'd spotted something little that was wrong. They were suggesting what sounded like a sensible fix, and the BBC wouldn't even consider it.
I'll move on, Rupert. You happy? Amen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Back on the splicing, in his Sacred Job memo to us, Dr. Shah mentions that since your memo, Mr. Prescott, the corporation's had 500 complaints, and that has, I quote, prompted further reflection. And as a result of that further reflection, the BBC now accepts that the splice gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. I remember the first time I saw the splice, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, that's awful. And then I checked a transcript of the speech itself, and that confirmed it. Were you surprised that it took the BBC multiple iterations and multiple months to work out something as straightforward as that splice was that misleading?
Yes, in a word. I mean, this was, in the memo I talk about my great frustration and how I'm writing to the board because of this frustration, and that was a very easy to understand example, that we had a BBC management that would defend and stand by that video edit, which is exactly what was going on, and that's why I was one of the reasons I was in despair, but it's possibly the purest example.
Do you think the corporation has what you might call a bigger truth problem? That there's a bigger truth that the vast majority of BBC output is good, therefore it's less important when something is misleading? Or indeed on the specific episode of Panorama, there was a bigger truth that the programme was trying to get across about that day and Capitol Hill and the character of President Trump, and therefore it didn't matter so much that this thing was spliced in a way that specific impression was clearly so misleading?
Well, I think the truth is we still don't know what went on within the Panorama production team, whether it was some weird kind of accident or someone working under pressure. We just don't know. But as regards the wider BBC, I mean, I've had people I know and don't know, texting me, emailing me and so on, who clearly appalled by that. So I don't think it's a bigger problem. It was just this curious management blind spot.
But obviously it wasn't just a management blind spot. I mean, lots of people must have had a blind spot. I mean, starting with the person who did it, then whoever was editing it, a producer, presumably somebody straight away. I mean, obviously it didn't get the most massive audience because people in general didn't spot it, but many people must have seen it. Then your committee saw it. Then it went up to the board. A lot of people apparently had a blind spot.
This is one of the most curious things about the whole saga, actually. So I watched the programme, as I said. I certainly didn't spot that the video had been spliced. I had no idea. And I doubt...
It was a very good splice job.
It's interesting if you did, but I suspect...
No, I didn't. It was an extremely good splice job.
Okay.
Where you couldn't see the scene, that's the point.
And you didn't realise it had happened. And when I asked for the panorama to be looked into, it was for reasons other than the video splicing. I thought there were other issues with it. But when the report came back, it just so... Because David Grossman, ex-Newsnight, very respected, proper, fabulous BBC correspondent, he'd also done time covering the US presidential election. So it was one of those weird coincidences that the person who was asked by the Standards Committee to go and do a deep dive into the panorama, was steeped in this material because he'd been out there covering it. And it was he who spotted the video splice. It's quite possible if it had been someone else asked to do a deep dive into panorama, they might have come back still not spotting that. It was a curious turn of events.
That was when? That was in time for the January meeting.
Yes, that's right.
An awful lot of time has passed between January and November. So there still were a lot of people who had a blind spot. So after this thing had been identified, I don't mean a literal blind spot, they didn't spot the splice. I don't think anybody spotted the splice. But having been brought to people's attention, a lot of people apparently overlooked it. Until, as Dr. Shah says, having had 500 complaints after your memo, there's been a period of reflection.
As I say, so I keep using this term blind spot. You can use the terminology you want. You know, they had a lack of sensitivity. They just had a different view about the video splice.
And I wonder if I might just finally ask both of you, if you would agree that actually it's people who would like to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones.
Me, by the way.
No.
I want it to be strong.
Just let me finish my sentence, if you will.
Sorry, beg your
so,
pardon.
it is people who would wish to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones who ought to downplay this incident. And people who love the BBC and think the BBC has a more important role than ever in the information meltdown and mosh pit and misinformation, disinformation, they are the ones who will say that when an incident like this comes along, it must be taken with the absolute utmost seriousness.
Yeah, that sounds a very sensible point to me. I mean, people who love and support the BBC, we want the BBC to be at its best, and that's what this whole thing's been about.
Obviously, issues of trust are foundational to the BBC. It is very important that they take inaccuracies extremely seriously. I would say, to echo Samir Shah, it was regrettable that this wasn't recognised at the time, and it was too late to, even though Panorama was alerted to this, I think it was too late by the BBC to actually take action on it. But I would point you to the fact in the committee at the time, it was a 20-page report, and the debate was really about a much broader, comprehensive view about US election coverage. It wasn't to try and micromanage a particular programme edit. And individual issues were typically dealt with by the editorial complaints unit if there was an inaccuracy.
I'm asking her about a principle, so I was asking about the splice, that is correct, but you could apply the same question to a number of other things in the memo. My question was really, isn't it the case that for all the 99-point-something% of output, which is very high quality and unquestionable, isn't it the case that if you really, really care about the future of the BBC, you really, really have to care about the 0-point-something% that goes wrong, take it absolutely as seriously as it warrants?
I agree with you. I think it is important, but I personally think that the BBC did take issues of impartiality and accuracy incredibly seriously. It's the reason that they're one of the most trusted news brands in the world.
Misinformation meltdown mosh pit. Cam.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prescott, I happen to agree that it's a catalogue of interesting circumstances that this documentary aired through such a large editorial process. So the question that I want to know the answer to is, prior to it airing, did this documentary deviate from the standard editorial or auditing processes in any way?
The short answer to that is I don't know, and that's exactly the kind of thing I was hoping that the BBC would look into. You know,
Who would know?
who would? Well, I guess that your best witness will be the next one. The BBC chairman may know about that. I only know what I saw on the screen and then what David Grossman reported upon.
Thank you. I've just realised you didn't quite answer my last question. Do you agree that Donald Trump's reputation has been tarnished by this documentary?
Probably not.
You don't agree with him? Thank you. Caroline, I've largely not spoken with you yet. Apologies. Have you seen David Grossman's report? Have you read it?
Yes.
Have you read Michael's memo?
Yes.
Would you agree that Michael's memo was an accurate reflection or response to that Grossman report?
I would say that Michael's memo does not provide a comprehensive view of what was in the David Grossman report.
What do you think was missing?
I think the David Grossman report covered a lot of ground, significant areas like the coverage of the election and the use of polling, issues like who was being represented on programmes, issues of impartiality. There was obviously a BBC response to it as well, which was also significant. They did engage with each of the details of the David Grossman report. I don't think Michael's account is a personal account rather than a comprehensive review of everything that was covered in the committee.
You describe it as biased?
I would not choose to characterise it that way. I think it's a personal account of what Michael wanted to bring before the board.
Thank you.
It was meant as I think Caroline's remarks may well be fair because I'm very open about this. I think I even say it in the memo. It was meant to be, you know, an edited take on things. It was a primer for the board, hoping to get some action, and they could then go away, as I think I urged them to do in the memo, to go and look at the full Grossman report. So I don't think I'd ever claim it was fully comprehensive. It was edited highlights intended to get action.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to that question, Caroline?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to come in on this one?
Just on that, Caroline, sorry again. You said that it doesn't provide a comprehensive review of the Grossman report. Do you think it gives an accurate sense of the Grossman report?
As I say, I repeat what I've just said. I think Michael's view was not designed to be a comprehensive view of everything in the David Grossman report. I think when you read the David Grossman report in full, it's a broader reflection of the debate that the committee had about issues and anticipating issues in terms of both existing coverage, was there something we should be looking at more closely, and are there actions that the BBC should be taking. My interpretation, my personal interpretation, was that the BBC engaged with this, the executive team responded, actions were taken. It was going to be an ongoing issue. This is a live, Donald Trump defines the news waves at the moment. It was an important issue to actually think ahead about how do we cover Donald Trump appropriately. So my takeaways were very much focused on that broader representative view. David Grossman's reports were not supposed to be comprehensive. They were quick takes, ad hoc research to help fuel a conversation in the committee, rather than the thematic reviews, which are much bigger picture, longer term, lots of interviews, comprehensive research, and looking at a much broader range of programmes.
Just to be clear, so the Grossman reports were the only ones that were asked for by the committee on this particular topic. There were no others.
No, on this case, no.
And Michael, just quickly, Dr. Shah said that your memos are, and I'm quoting, a partial description of the evidence that the EGSC received. Is it fair to describe your memo as partial?
My memo is partial. I don't really think so. As I say, it was edited highlights intended to get action. So whether you want to call it partial or not, it was certainly impartial. Well, there was nothing in that would mislead the audience in it. I think it was a reasonable edit of all the areas concerned that arose out of the Grossman reports. In that sense, you could, I suppose it'd be fair on the American one, for example, say it's unbalanced, because I didn't mention where David Grossman praised the coverage. I only mentioned where there were problems. But I don't mean to sound arrogant. I don't really apologise for that. I mean, it was 19 pages as it was, for one thing. And if you do read the full Grossman report, I don't know whether you're getting hold of it or not, into the American election coverage, see what you make of it. But my plea, you see, is fine, wherever the BBC earns a gold star, that's great. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't take the problem seriously. So I think the first thing there was they broke their own guidelines on how to use opinion polls. Well, what was done about that after? How did that problem occur? And what's being done about that to prevent an accidental reoccurrence? Answer, we do not know.
I think that, would you agree though that they have acknowledged that was an issue? I'm just looking at a quote saying that was the one significant exception to our usually excellent record of reporting polling. So that particular problem with that particular poll was acknowledged. Yeah,
but this goes to my one remaining worry. But I should have said, by the way, I really welcome the BBC chairman's letter to you where he says he's going to go through everything in my memo point by point, which is in a way all I wanted. The one worry I still have is, will the BBC do that, treating every issue there as if it is a systemic problem until they can prove that it's not? So the issue there about the opinion polling, they say they've responded to it and acknowledged it. Okay, but were there systems that went wrong? Was it if it was one single human error on one night, fine. But if not, there's a bigger problem. What's gone wrong here? They need to get under the bonnet and start fiddling around with the spanner of it.
How do they demonstrate that they fix those systemic problems?
Well, for starters, whoever takes the place of Caroline and myself on the Standards Committee, hopefully they can persuade them that they've been doing a more thorough job. And if there was to be wider scrutiny, and it's for BBC as an institution to figure that out, and of course you as the Select Committee have an oversight role.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, you mentioned sort of primer for the board. A comment you just made earlier in terms of sort of like your communication, and you started off earlier when you said that you was a strong supporter in your formative years, how important the BBC was, and I think that many people in this room, myself included, sort of BBC is sort of very important in terms of our sort of education as well.
Yeah.
So, did you foresee the damage your memo would cause?
Absolutely not, because it was. Remember.
Sorry, but no. I paused. That's why you came in. My apologies. But what I would say to you is, did you not see an opportunity, or did you not see a scenario where that memo would be wider circulated?
No. It went, as I say, it went to 14 members of the BBC board, and then senior people at Ofcom, DCMS, who, as I said, BBC is independent, but they have some role in terms of dialogue with the BBC. So, no. And also, I look back, what was I to do? I could have done nothing. But you can hopefully tell from the memo the level of my concern, and I wanted someone somewhere to start doing something.
No, I understand that. But it's obviously been, in some cases you can argue it's possibly being weaponised, and you spoke about people on the political spectrums sort of grasping that and trying to sort of damage the BBC, so to speak. So I'm just surprised you're surprised we've got to this point.
Well, on the weaponised thing, this is a personal view, but whether people at the BBC think this stuff's been weaponised or not, surely that's a secondary issue. There are very specific things that have been going wrong, detailed in the Grossman reports, detailed in my memo. Now the BBC, they say they're going to look at them one by one. Hopefully they'll treat them as systemic problems, in which case the BBC will end up stronger, and I want it stronger so it can conquer the globe. So this, where you're coming from, which is, surely you realise there was a risk of damage. Even as I sit here now, my hope and my genuine belief is the BBC is going to end up stronger because of all this stuff. And it'd be great. They can reach billions on this planet with their news and current affairs, given that we're in the era of fake news, if they get this stuff right.
Caroline, what's your view about what I asked Michael in terms of how this has impacted the organisation?
It's obviously been an extremely challenging time for the BBC. It's on the spotlight on issues of impartiality, which in my view the BBC was actively engaging with on a regular basis at a as I point out, the fact that the committee was extremely robust, discussions were had, research was commissioned on a regular basis, and it was challenging research. I think that's a really healthy organisation and a very healthy debate.
Thank you. There was a term about sort of systemic and processes, about possibly the BBC not listening, the editorial team not listening, and you gave some examples. And one of the examples was about the insurance, about that sort of misrepresentation and that ethnic minority sort of penalty.
Yeah.
With regards to that sort of insurance story, the BBC sort of acknowledged it was wrong and published a correction in 2024-25 in their annual report, and it's that an example of the EGSC working as intended.
Well, there's a complaints process, as you know, that occurs in quite separately from the Standards Committee. Any member of the public can complain, and it's dealt with by certain machinery. The Standards Committee keeps an eye on that and see what they think of it. But this particular story you mentioned to, and the BBC apology, again, sorry for being a broken record, but again, this comes back to whether a problem is systemic or not. How did they get that so wrong? There were multiple levels of failure there, and I know of nowhere, it certainly didn't come before the Standards Committee, that the BBC treated it as such and looked into every stage of failure and what they could learn from what went wrong.
Okay. So given the resolution of the insurance story, why did you not sort of mention that or reiterate it in your memo?
What, the insurance story?
Yeah.
It is in my memo, yeah.
What the BBC, the reiterate, so why did you not sort of mention that the BBC had dealt with it?
Because the point I was trying to make to the board is the same one I'm trying to make to you, and I think I'd run through the possible levels of editorial failure, who commissioned it, what did the programme editors make of this before it went out, where was the professional scepticism over this claim. So I was trying to make the point to the board, I think the BBC should look at that, among many others, as if it's a systemic problem, and I wanted them to support me in that notion.
Caroline, can you give me an example where the EGSE sort of considered the subject that concerned you and reached a consensus that you were satisfied with?
Sorry, just to clarify that I wasn't satisfied with.
That you were satisfied with.
I think on the insurance, I'm just picking up that one straight away. Action was taken. There was a debate at the board. It was embarrassing for the team in terms of their understanding of data journalism. There were further actions taken about actually doing more training within the BBC about how to understand probability and really proper economics understanding across some of the team. There were new people put in terms of the data science team. So I think, in my view, that counts as action and significant action from the EGSC. If it hadn't come up in the EGSC, it probably would have come up via the editorial complaints unit if there had been concerns, which obviously is another part. It's another part of our monitoring. It's not just this committee, but the editorial complaints unit also has a significant role in looking in issues of inaccuracy. I think another example I can bring up is we looked at the role of BBC Verify and the sort of issues of misinformation at the BBC, and are there issues in terms of complaints coming in that actually show that we should be concerned about whether reporters were falling for fake news. In my view, I think we should be spending a lot of time on those issues. And going forward, if I had one piece of advice for Chris Saul, it's actually that you have longer, deeper dives into some of these, really big existential issues for the BBC's journalism. And it really matters to get that right. So we can, in particularly in an era when trust is incredibly important, and when the internet is becoming a source of massive scale misinformation. So in my view, I think the BBC engaged that on the last 3 years. We did have conversations about that. I like to see the BBC having even more focus on that going forwards, and a wider frame of views and more deeper dives on issues like that.
Okay, thank you. Michael, last question. Any other examples where you feel that...
The committee operated by consensus? In a funny way, in my mind, it probably operated by consensus on almost everything, the exception being, and of course it's the glaring, that's why we're all here, the exception being management's response to some of the David Grossman's more critical findings, where there wasn't a consensus. The management went one way. There were some members of the committee who remained unhappy with it, and you can clearly see I remained unhappy with it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faye.
Sorry, just very, very quickly. So given that there was an investigation into the insurance piece, given that an action was taken, given that the BBC acknowledged there was an issue, I'm wondering how much is that systemic or just a cock-up, rather than like conspiracy versus cock-up? Is it just a mistake was made, the BBC investigated, it was corrected, and then if it had, because action was taken, why did you feel the need to put it into your memo?
Oh, because, right, so to me, sort of journalistic error might be I misspell someone's name or I get the date wrong, you know, an error. And of course, by the way, errors occur. I really don't want to come across someone who thinks otherwise or is intolerant of the occasional human failure. But this report was way more than that, okay? So the BBC launched this service called Verify, clues in the name. It's supposed to be even better than your ordinary BBC. It'll check everything out, hard data. And to launch Verify, one of the things that happened was that this report was emblazoned across the BBC Breakfast, lunchtime news, 6 o'clock news, all the bulletins. This was a big deal at the BBC. We've got a shocking new exclusive for the world. And what went wrong cannot have been surely one person's error. How did they have this notion to study this idea that insurance companies would be charging ethnic minority people more? Who compiled the report? Who checked it? Who edited it? Which output editor said it was okay? Of all the people across the BBC who heard that report, was there no professional scepticism? Geez, we'd better have another look at that. This was multiple levels of failure. And that's why I put it in the memo.
Caroline's just outlined that better training has been put in place for data analysis, because look, anyone can look at a spreadsheet and come up with an answer for anything. So she's outlined the actions that were taken off the back of that, a clear failure. Where that has happened, is that not the BBC behaving in the way it should behave?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, because this is you zeroed right in on an area of potential continuing disagreement between me and the BBC. So you see, you probably get more of this from the chairman. So yeah, on that one they organised some retraining. They had a look into their use of statistics. To me, now, feel free to disagree with me. To me, just not enough. This was a horrendous and embarrassing error. One, by the way, that could have damaged community relations in this country. I mean, if you're a black teenager sitting at home all day listening to that stuff, how would it make you feel? And it was all untrue. So I think they should have had what you might call a full-on inquest. And I'm not clear they ever did.
Okay. Can I just quickly talk to you about BBC Arabic? It comes in for some quite heavy criticism in your memo. We know the BBC Arabic, on average, are having to apologise for around about 2 articles a week at the moment. But in answer to our letter, the BBC, the chairman, said that they are determined to attempt to tackle the underlying problems identified by both the EGSE and Mr. Prescott. Are those steps sufficient, Michael?
Well, in my view, it depends what he means by that, but I take him to be in good faith, and I'm delighted by that promise. I alluded in the memo to how, vis-a-vis BBC Arabic, I think I put a phrase in, there have been some changes of personnel, a measure in which the Director General seems to place great faith. Because, yet again, you see, my view is just switching out an editor or two is not enough. When you've got such shocking catalogue of seeming errors, there must be more going wrong than just the editor on that day wasn't quite up to the job.
Yeah, thanks. So we've established that the two of you, it was advertised. The David Grossman role was internal.
Well, I think you need to check. I think it was, but I'm really not sure about the Grossman one. Probably best to ask the
It just seems, the memo was very reliant on that one individual. I think you said to Jeff you didn't entertain any other evidence. I mean, surely, isn't it sort of incumbent on you to take evidence from a range of different sources? So throughout your time, there was also the Gaza Doctors Under Attack documentary that a lot of staff were exercised about at the all-staff meeting. There were various other things that happened. The NUJ and BEC2 have written to us. There's 21,000 members of BBC staff. Right. Hundreds of them attend the all-staff meetings. Why was none of their evidence in your memo? Why is it just all slanted to one individual and one political point?
Well, I suppose you can't boil the ocean, for one thing. And my memo was what it was presented as being, which was a summary of internal reports that had come before the Standards Committee and not been acted upon fully enough.
So, okay. I mean, I just wondered also what your relationship is with these gentlemen, with Robbie Gibb. The FT says that you're a friend of his. I don't know, maybe you can clear that up for us. And with David Grossman.
So David Grossman, I only know through him being appointed this role and the Standards Committee. Robbie Gibb, I've known for a number of years. I first met him, I think, when I was working briefly for the political staff of the Daily Mirror, and he worked for BBC Westminster. So, yes, I do know Robbie Gibb, but you've got to appreciate 14, 15 years working as a political correspondent here. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say I got to know hundreds of people on a cross-party basis. Even today, I've got dozens and dozens of friends from that period of my life, and I've got as many Labour Party friends, Lib Dem friends as Conservative friends. But yes, I do know Robbie.
And would you call him a friend? Because there's all these rumours swirling around.
Yes, I think that's a fair description, yeah.
Okay, and would you be prepared to publish communications between the two of you in the sort of lead up to the appointment and since the memo?
To the EGSC?
To the committee, to us.
Sorry,
would you be prepared
to publish what?
Communications that you had in the run-up to getting the job, maybe to squash some rumours that are out there. And since the memo was published, which mysteriously found its way into the Telegraph, nobody quite knows how.
Well, on the first of your things, the editorial, getting the job on the Standards Committee, that was openly advertised, and it was an open competitive process, so I'm not sure quite what it is.
Yeah, no, the question was, would you publish communications that you had, emails?
Well, that's quite a precedent you're asking me to set. What I'm happy to do is say to you that I've had, for example, I haven't seen, my last meeting of the Standards Committee was in June. I haven't seen him since then. I think I've had one conversation with him since then. That's it.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mr. Prescott, can you understand why somebody might find it suspicious that somebody who is described as a friend might have a role in that individual's appointment?
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair enough question, but
if that's a fair enough question, then will you submit the documentation that my...
Well, like I said, it's quite a precedent to set, but let me answer your question directly. So I applied for the Standards Committee position as described. There was then, you had to put in written submission, written thing, and then there was an interview. The interview panel was 4 people, one of whom was from HR. Now, you feel free to criticise me. I just took the point of view, well, if BBC, BBC does do that sort of thing well, if BBC HR are involved, I thought it was fine.
I'm not criticising you. I'm just suggesting that it's interesting that somebody you've described as a friend had a role in your appointment. You don't think that's unusual?
Well, I suppose the thing is, if you operate in this country, in the sphere of politics, the media and so on, it's not that unusual to come across people you know. I mean, it happens all the time. So unusual, well, I don't know.
Can I ask, Michael, if even a memo warning about issues of impartiality has issues with selective quoting and perceptions of bias, is there any hope that anyone can ever be an effective and trusted arbiter of impartiality?
Well, the BBC gets as close as any organisation in the world ever has, and I think it is achievable so long as you're open, transparent, honest, and here, this is in a sense what this session's about, isn't it? And you're willing to take it on the chin when you get it wrong and look into what's gone wrong thoroughly and put in a full programme of reform if needed. So I think it's achievable enough. And by the way, the BBC is the best positioned organisation in the world to do that, even with everything we're discussing, in my view.
That brings us to an end. Can I thank you so much for appearing in front of us this afternoon and for all your time. Is there anything that either of you would like to conclude with before we end today? Caroline?
I don't think so, but thank you so much. I'd just say a big thank you, because obviously this has been all over the news for whatever it is, 3 weeks now. I've deliberately avoided the media for numerous reasons, but not least because I have great respect for Parliament, and also a session like this, you can go through things so much more thoroughly than one media interview, so I'm really appreciative.
We're very grateful for both of you for coming in to see us this afternoon and for answering all our very many questions. We're now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow the next panel to come in. Thank you very much. Order, order. Order, order. We're back for our second panel, and we have Dr. Samir Shah, the Chair of the BBC and Chair of the BBC Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee. We have Sir Robbie Gibb, the Non-Executive Director of the BBC and member of the BBC Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee, and Caroline Thomson, a Non-Executive Director of the BBC and also member of the BBC Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee. Thank you to all of us for appearing before us today. You have probably seen the first panel, so I won't repeat my introduction to the session today, but suffice to say, Dr. Shah, you're once again in front of us at a point where the BBC is said to be in crisis and where the board appears to be in crisis too. Now, you'll probably recall when this committee first met you, we were a little bit frustrated that you seemed unable to take a definitive stance on anything, and we wanted you to give us strong, unequivocal answers. So I want us to make sure that we start off on the right foot today. Did the BBC block the head of news from apologising for the Panorama programme before the 10th of November?
I will directly answer that question, but if you may forgive me, I'd like to take this opportunity first of all to apologise to all the people who believe in the BBC and care for it and wish it to survive and thrive. I'd like to apologise to the licence fee payer who funds the BBC to deliver its mission. And I'd like to apologise to the thousands of people who work for the BBC, our staff, who work with such dedication and commitment to deliver the output we all enjoy so much. I regret the mistakes that have been made and the impact that has had. Let me now come to the question that you asked. Just, if I may ask you, just repeat it for me so I can answer it directly.
Did you block the head? Did you and the rest of the BBC board block the head of news from apologising for the Panorama programme on the 10th of November?
We go back to the week in which the story broke in the Telegraph, and you wrote to me, and I was writing the answer to you. I heard that the news wanted to apologise for the splicing of the edit with a white spark. I thought that was a necessary thing to do, but wasn't sufficient, because the fundamental issue here was the sequencing of the edit and the placing of the Proud Boys march. I think the real issue here was the impression left that the President Trump, in his 6th of January speech, had called to violent action, and what we had to apologise for was that, as well as the splicing of the edit. It's my view that editing interviews is a normal journalistic practice. So that in itself is not what the problem was. The problem was the impression that it led, that it was an impression that President Trump had called for direct violent action, and that wasn't the case, and that is what I thought needed to be apologised for. So the answer to your question is, I didn't think it was adequate. I thought it was necessary but not sufficient.
If you felt that that was the case, then why was there no apology when David Grossman first brought that to your attention?
You mean in the EGSC meetings in January and May? Mm. I think that's a very fair question, and I'm looking back, I think we should have made the decision earlier, I think in May, as it happens. In January, you've heard earlier that the report came about, which was about, the context was how well, as we do, constantly review our own coverage, how we did, what went well, what didn't go well, and we examined how we covered the US elections as a general point. And the report came back, as you've said, that the coverage was on the whole excellent, but there were some real issues there. We're invited, and there was at that meeting also coverage of the Arabic service, which we may come back to. I invited, which is normal, for news to give me a formal response to that research. That response came in May. When that response came, one thing I'd like to make clear is that this was a constructive discussion that took place at the EGSC. Some very important observations were made in that report, which the executives took on. For me, one of the most interesting ones was the recognition about the story selection idea, and I have a letter in front of me, the news report, you've got it, which said the BBC infrastructure is heavily resourced in the democratic areas, and we need to move into other parts of the US to get a better sense of opinion within it. And that is an action that's going to be taken, and there's going to be movement of which our resources tap into not just the democratic heartlands where we have got, in a way, over too many resources that we need to move it out. I give that example simply to tell you all that this wasn't a discussion where you had a defensive news response to some very serious issues. So that was it. When it came to the Panorama edit, there was a difference of opinion across the board. And looking back, I think it would have been better for us to pursue it then. I completely accept that. And as we go into my own understanding of how we got here, it seems to me, along with the editorial and the governance, which are important issues which we'll unpack, I think there is an issue about how quickly we respond, the speed of our response. Why do we not do it quickly enough? Why do we take so much time? And this was another illustration of that. We should have, as a collective, we should have pursued it to the end and got to the bottom of it and not wait, as we did, till it became public discourse. I mean, I have a lot of things to say about my relationship with Mr. Prescott and that report and what he did.
We've got lots of questions to come on to along that line, but what I'm trying to get to, there's been a lot of speculation in the media that it was the inaction and the delay by the BBC board, and it's reported in the press as that there was a dispute in the BBC board that has caused so much of the dramas ever since. I'm just really interested to know why it took so long. Why didn't you get on the front foot? If you'd have got on the front foot and, either with an apology or with a robust defence, either I think, would have been an acceptable way of responding to this. But it's that huge delay. So, I mean, why? What was causing the delay? What were your reasons for delaying?
It seems to me there are two types of timeline. One is the one that began with the EGSC report in January.
I'm talking about when the
and then there's a
report.
week after the report was in some way leaked to the public and the Telegraph. Do you mean that particular?
I mean, as soon as the Telegraph started publishing this memo and its coverage of it, there was just a vacuum in the BBC for nearly a week where there was no comment given of any meaningful way to the substance of it. Why didn't you get on the front foot with either an apology or some kind of defence of what had happened?
But precisely for the question you've just raised, I needed to understand what went wrong and to get the right answer. Getting the right answer was really important.
You knew what went wrong because you'd already had the Grossman report into this and your own.
When we went in that week, I asked the Director General to review, because I said we reflected on it, to review the clip and whether there were any serious editorial breaches. There were, as an outcome of that, and that was the research that had to be done to get it right. It took time to get it right. We knew what the actual apology was for. I said it wasn't just about the splicing, the editing, it was about the impression, and that had to be done properly and investigated thoroughly. As well as that, I was writing a response to you from the board. I have 13 board members, and I needed to make sure that they were aware about what I was writing, and I had their support. I admit, that did take time, and of course it would always be better to be able to get out quickly, but it's as important for me to get it right and to get it supported by the board.
If the BBC had responded quicker, do you think that the resignations might not have happened?
That's a hypothetical I can't answer. All I will say is that I think the resignation of the CEO of News was a very honourable act. I think it was right of her to take responsibility for an error in her division. As she herself said, the buck stops with me. And I said, in public life, it's rare to find people who accept that something went wrong in their own division and accept responsibility and take responsibility, and I applaud her for that.
Your culture and media editor, Katie Razzle, reported that Deborah Turnus became more and more angry and frustrated as the week went on because she was prevented by the board from putting out that apology. Was that in some way to blame for the fact that she then resigned from her post?
You would have to ask her. I've already repeated, I thought the apology that was on the table was necessary but not sufficient.
Did you try and stop her from resigning?
I spoke to Director General about it. The resignation or otherwise of the head of news is a matter for the Director General, not for the board or for the chair. My job is to test and challenge the Director General. It's an operational editorial matter, who he hires and who he doesn't hire underneath him.
Then the Director General resigned as well. Did you try and stop him from resigning?
I did indeed, and I spent a great deal of time. I do not think the Director General should have resigned. I think that the act by the Director of News was an honourable and proper act. I think she took responsibility, for which I will again say I applaud her for doing so. I do not think that meant that the Director General had also had to resign. However, when you read the Director General's reason for resigning, certainly this was one factor, but he also says there were many other factors that led to that. I wish, and can I say the board wishes, that the Director General had not resigned. He had our full confidence throughout.
Sure.
Yes, Cam.
An organisation as large as the BBC, I would imagine it should have occurred to you that you could have put out an initial statement while you were still trying to get to grips with the gravity of what had happened prior to a full apology. Did you receive pressure from anybody else on that board to delay such an apology?
Absolutely not. What I would say, we did put out a full statement, which was, looking back, rather vanilla in its statement, as corporate BBC tends to do. And we did do it to hold, because I needed to put out a fuller statement, but I needed to be sure and I was right about what I was saying. This was a very, very important error, and I needed to make sure that what I was apologising for was fully sourced and fully right. It needed to be right, and it took its time.
The resignation of the Director General is quite a big deal, is it not? When you tried to dissuade Tim Davie from his resignation, how did that conversation go?
I don't think it is right for me to discuss private conversations with me and the Director General.
Well, it might be if the BBC is at stake.
Well, I think confidential statements, conversations need to remain confidential. But let me answer your question. I know Tim, and I've got to know Tim very well over the last 18 months. He is an outstanding Director General. He is extraordinarily good. His energy, his dedication, his commitment to the BBC cannot be gainsaid.
His commitment was broken.
Well, as you know in his statement, he felt responsible as Editor-in-Chief for the error. My view was the responsibility was taken by the Chief of News, and that was proportionate.
Thanks, Chair.
Can I just quickly take you back to the response to the committee's letter, November the 4th? You apologised on behalf of the BBC for the way that the Trump speech on the 6th of January were edited. Your words were, the BBC does accept the way that the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for that error of judgment. Dr. Shah, I've had a look at the BBC editorial guidelines, section 3.4.25 of the BBC's editorial policy. That says, for news, factual and some factual entertainment content, unless clearly signalled to the audience or other reconstructions, content makers should not normally intercut shots and sequences if the resulting juxtaposition of material leads to a materially misleading impression of events. It seems quite clear to me that the way that both the Newsnight and Panorama edited this clip broke those BBC editorial guidelines. So what I'm just trying to get to grips with is why it took a year to apologise for this failing, despite the EGSC, which you chair, having concerns about this programme on 3 separate occasions, and why no action was taken despite the fact that there was a clear evidence of a breach of editorial guidelines.
As I said, in the January meeting, that report came out. I then invited the news division to give me a formal response to it. That response took place in May, and we discussed it then, and there was a different set of opinions around it. There was a plausible case that this edit, because the point of the programme was to deliver to the British audience because it was about the supporters for President Trump and what they were learning. So there was a case for, as it were, the edit. This was discussed and debated, and there was a difference of opinion. I've already said we should have pursued it further at that time. And by pursuing it further, we should have investigated it in detail with the people responsible in the BBC to do that. You must remember, that is an operational matter and not a matter for, in governance terms, for the non-execs. But it is a matter which we could have pursued harder, is what I would say, and we should have done. Had we done so, then what you've just read out would have come out, and there would have been a formal response that this did breach that, and we would have then taken on.
What was the tipping point that prompted your apology? Was it the 500 letters of complaint to the BBC? Was it the resignation of the Director General? Was it the memo?
No, straight away.
Wait a second. Yes. Or was it the threat of legal action from the President of the United States?
I'm sorry, say that again. The last one?
The threat of legal action from the President of the United States. What was the sort of tipping point in suddenly deciding that apology was forthcoming? The memo, the Director General going, the letters of complaint, or the threat of legal action from the President?
As I wrote to you, when the memo entered public discourse, there were a lot of complaints about it. And we decided at that moment to reflect and review the decision. And that's when we came out with the outcome that, yes, it was a mistake. It was an error of judgment, and that's what I wrote to you, and then later on.
Just to be clear, had this not have been covered by the memo and prompted all these letters of complaint, that would probably have never, it would never have come back. It would never have risen back to the surface.
It's worth noting that in many discussions, there had been no complaints to the BBC News about this. So there was no. If that had happened, we could have looked at it. As I said, again, there was a discussion at the board about this, and there was a debate, and because there had been no formal complaints, we let it rest. As you probably all know, very soon after that, I was uncomfortable with that outcome and that result, and I initiated. It wasn't the only reason. I had a number of things over the time I've been chair, which I worried about the workings of this committee, whether it was properly defined, whether the relationship with the board, with the main board, was precise enough, with the terms of reference with the advisors, whether the composition was good. And I invited Chris Saul in June to look again at, long before this broke. I did think there were things to be done, and that process was underway. One of those things, and maybe Caroline will talk about it, one of those things was, what is the mechanic when at a board, at a committee, there's disagreement within it? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that in such a way that we don't cross that line between governance and editorial? It's an important line we hold, but it does seem to me that this is thrown up there. As I said, one of the issues I have to face is, what were the governance failures here? What were the process failures? And one of them is that. And I think we do need to find a way, and Caroline is going to be looking into that. I'd started it with Chris Saul. Chris Saul had some interim findings. We were underway. I should say, as you know, I listened intently to your conversation with Mr. Prescott. I met him several times during that period. I invited him to talk to Chris Saul, and they met to discuss it. After the letter went out, I talked to him again. After we met the board, I talked to him, and I said, I would like you to be engaged in fixing what's wrong with the EGSC, how we can get it to a state where you would not have cause to write such a letter again. I did that. He seemed to rise to it. So perfect. So we were going to carry on. Don't think this committee should think I ignored Mr. Prescott. I did not. I think he raised some important questions we need to answer. I've already said I don't think it was a rounded picture of what actually happened in the EGSC, and I think you've heard from your other witness that, in fact, the executive took many actions, detailed actions. So it wasn't just a case of a report coming out and a defensive reaction. That just is not an accurate account of what happened.
It was reported in the press quite a lot that the reason for the delay in the board responding to our letter and indeed sort of opining in any way on what had happened was because there was a big difference of opinion at board level. Is that true?
In May? Do you mean?
No, we're talking about recently in response to all the news that came out. You lost, two very key, very senior members of the BBC team, and then still we waited for you to say anything.
At the board meeting in October, when we discussed the memo, we discussed it at length, and there was a certain repeating of what happened at the EGSC, but it was important we discussed it, and there was some differences of opinion. But we did agree on the next step at that meeting, and the next step was for me to go back to Mr. Prescott, discuss his email to the board, and invite him to be part of reviewing how the EGSC could work better, to which he agreed. And then, as we know, a few days later, it was all over the papers.
Memo hit the papers, but that's not what I asked you. What I asked you is, there was this big delay between the newspapers covering this story and the board coming out with either a statement or a response to the letter that we wrote. And it's been reported in the press that the reason for that delay was because there was a big dispute within the board about how to respond. There was, in some cases, people said chaos in the board. How true is that?
There was neither chaos nor that. The delay was, you wrote to me on the Tuesday, I replied to you on the Monday. That was the deadline you gave me. During that time, I wanted to investigate it, what went wrong, and get it right, and I needed to make sure the board were with me. And we discussed this. I don't think there was any chaos or difficulty there.
But I think, yes, if I could just add, because I was obviously part of some of those discussions, there was a continuing and sharp difference of opinion between certainly the chairman and me and some others on the board with the director of news about whether we were going to apologise just for the edit or whether the impact of the edit and indeed the positioning of the Proud Boys material had given a misleading impression. We felt that it had. And the news continued to maintain that actually the impression given, despite the edit, was correct because the gist of the speech by Trump had, for example, the use of the word fight 15 times and only talked about peace once. And they felt that the edit was justified, but it should have been a more transparent edit. We felt that the edit had led to a more profound problem. And indeed, your quotation of the editorial guidelines is absolutely right. We felt it violated them.
Thank you. Natasha?
Thanks so much for coming in today. So just to Sir Robbie, what is your view? What, in your view, took the board so long to publish a response?
There was definitely a difference of opinion, and it was properly outlined by Samir and Caroline. It all came down to whether, from my perspective, the point I was making, that there was a serious error, and simply having an identifiable edit and apologising for that would not be enough, because what mattered was what the meaning was. So on the one hand, you could argue that if you had a white flash that showed where the edit was, then that would be fine, and you apologise for not having the white flash. My view, and I think the editorial policy view, independent, is that if the meaning of the new constructed white flash edit followed by the Proud Boys gave the impression that it was a call to arms, it was a breach of editorial policy. That was my view. The discussions around that delayed the actual reply to this committee's letter, I was not involved in, but I was involved in the debate in the board, and this was the point I was making.
Just sort of in response to the memo in general, so there wasn't much kind of said publicly in response to it. What kind of how did we get to the point where we weren't really kind of responding to the points that were raised publicly for quite a long time?
You mean the response to the Michael Prescott's memo to the board?
In total?
Yes. Publicly, we didn't hear anything about it until the leak. So, why was there such a delay and kind of like a robust response to it?
Well, I suppose you would say the delay begins the moment it's leaked publicly. Let me make that separate from the response to the memo itself. When the memo came, and I spoke to Mr. Prescott about it, it went to the board. Accompanying that memo was a separate note which provided, in my view, a more rounded picture of all, which you heard in your early session, all the different issues that the EGSC have examined, and also, may I say, the actions taken, including on some of the actions that Mr. Prescott appears to think no actions were taken, and that's simply not the case. We did take actions. Actions were you discussed at length the car insurance story. I find it interesting that that was one that Mr. Prescott picked up. We didn't need the complaint. We ourselves, or the executives, may I say, discovered it, thought it was wrong, took it down within 6 days, and it featured as, I think, in the annual report as a serious editorial breach. I don't think you can actually argue the case that the executive did not do anything. I mean, that is just simply an unfair account of it. I think on many of the areas that he spoke in this letter, which, as you've all heard, was a partial account of what was actually done, all the various really important discussions we had in our thematic reviews about economy, about tax and spend, and about immigration and migration. Again, it's not the case that nobody in the BBC knows about this. Andrew Dilnott, who wrote the text, spent a long time after the report going around the newsroom explaining it. Madeleine Sumption did so. We are committed to learning the lessons. I mean, I was partly involved at the beginning on the migration one, so I know a bit about it. I know all the people I spoke to. And like all these reports, there are things that the BBC journalists do well, and there are things that can improve on. There were a number of recommendations. So I just think you mustn't get away with thinking that the EGSC is not a functioning committee that does take on board issues, dig deep into things, talks about more urgent matters, and the executive, on the whole, respond positively and constructively to it.
I just want to come back to the memo and the kind of leaking. Yes. So, Robbie, were you aware that it was going to leak?
Absolutely not, of course not.
So when you worked on the Sorota report, has the term that came out of that consistently was the culture of defensiveness in the BBC. Do you think that's changed since then?
I do think it's changed. I know that Tim Davey, the outgoing Director General, very passionate about that, and in relation to the press office, that there had been, I think, a computer says no default position and circling the wagons. I genuinely don't think that is the case anymore. I mean, of course, people are always naturally defensive when you're being criticised, but I think there has been a cultural change. Just want to say about the Prescott report more generally. I think there was a lot in the report that I think a lot of people at the BBC management agree with. It was basically copied in large part from the David Grossman report, but it was a snapshot in time, and this is crucial to your point. It is not that it was particularly unrepresented of the Grossman reports from the time, but a lot has happened since then, and we've had all the action plan which we can go through with you. And on the car insurance is a very good example. He feels very passionate about it. I know about this particular story. It took quite a while between his original email and when it was eventually properly discussed at EGSC. But once the committee had the full facts in front of it, as Samir was saying, it took only 6 days to deal with it.
Caroline, do you have anything to say around the kind of defensiveness within the BBC?
I think there's always a natural tendency to want to perhaps not be defensive but support your staff, particularly in journalism where of course there's a lot of people taking risks and really working under a lot of pressure. So I think amongst management, having been once a news manager myself, there's a natural tendency to think, hold on a minute, I need to sort of protect them. But actually the thing that strikes me, and I as you may know, I've recently come back to the BBC as a non-exec, having been an executive before, but having had a 15-year gap, is the extraordinary seriousness with which the BBC continually investigates itself and questions itself and reviews its output with a view to getting higher standards. I think that's the thing. The lack of understanding of that, I think, is the thing that most concerns me, because actually there are endless debates about when can you call something genocide and when don't you, and how where did we get it right and where did we get it wrong, for example. I think to characterise a support environment as a defensive environment is to mischaracterise it, actually.
And just to Sir Robbie, so you've clearly a man of very strong political convictions and have held multiple posts both at the BBC and then over at Number 10 for the last couple of decades. And how have you managed to keep these roles separate and managed your own bias, given that this is all about, accusing the BBC of bias and accusing the BBC of not being able to look at its own lines? So how do you manage your own?
So I was Director of Communications for the government for 2 years, but I was a BBC news producer for 25 years, including being a programme editor and head of BBC Westminster. So I have a long track record. I primarily want to be defined as my commitment to the BBC, not my 2 years working for Theresa May. When I first joined, I think I joined the BBC in 1991, it was drummed into me about impartiality, and it's one of those things, those early impressions have basically dominated my thinking, and it's why I wanted to stick with the BBC. You're told to leave your politics at the door. And impartiality isn't just a sort of a moral obligation, it's also a legal obligation. I'll tell you one thing that's really, really important. If you want to find the people that are most critical of journalism when it becomes biased or inaccurate, it's other BBC journalists, because their reputations are damaged by it. And I think there couldn't be a bigger mismatch between the way I'm presented in some quarters in relation to my attitude. I think I've become weaponised in terms of how I'm perceived. Everyone who know me, I'm hugely impartial. I have friends across the political divide. I have impartiality through my bones, and I've always been a big campaigner.
I appreciate, but there is a question of sort of perception. Is it so? How do you manage perception? You said it's been weaponised, but I suppose it's difficult for people to separate those things.
Sure. One of the problems of being a non-exec member of the board is it's very, very hard to speak for yourself. You get calls from the journalists asking for a response, and you just don't want to engage. And that's one of the reasons I'm absolutely delighted to come here and give an opportunity to set out my case, where hopefully I can demonstrate that the perception is actually wrong.
Will you move on?
No, carry on. At the end of yours, whenever.
I've got a couple of. Cam, do you want to come in?
If that's all right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. So, Robbie, you talk about leaving your bias at the door. Shortly after you took over at the Jewish Chronicle, a second-generation columnist, Jonathan Friedman, resigned, stating that too often the Jewish Chronicle reads like a partisan ideological instrument, its judgments political rather than journalistic. How does that tally with your statement about leaving politics at the door?
Well, I think you got your timeline wrong. That particular statement happened after I had left. I left any involvement in the Jewish Chronicle in August 2024. A number of points I'd like to set out here is, firstly, I had no editorial role whatsoever on the Jewish Chronicle. It had no bearing whatsoever in my work with the BBC. My relationship with the Jewish Chronicle was fully declared. And Chair, if I had the opportunity to explain why I ended up being a non-Jewish person chairing or being a director of the Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle is the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, 200 years old. It was about to go under through liquidation. I was approached to join a consortium by an elderly Jewish fund, person.
Remember his name?
Well, adventures, I will come to that. Philanthropist, and that's not his name. That's obviously his role. And it was his involvement and his funding of the Jewish Chronicle was conditioned on him not becoming a public person, because you can see more recently, but even then, the amount of the safety issues were very, very high indeed. So the original plan was for me to be director for like 2 weeks after we won. It ended up being a lot longer than that because there was complications in how charity law had changed. So I was doing a favour. I didn't get paid, had no particular reason to be involved other than I was asked to do so. I had no involvement editorially whatsoever, and it's now, and it for unfortunate reasons, I ended up owning it or being director of it for much longer than I'd anticipated.
What was your role in the establishment of GB News?
After leaving Number 10 and before I joined the board, I was approached to help with a fundraise, and I helped with the fundraise, presenting what I thought my vision of GB News, which is somewhat different to the way it's turned out. But I never worked for GB News once it became a news channel.
Thank you.
Ruby, did you want to come in on
Thanks. Yeah, just off the back of the questions Natasha was asking. Good to meet the three of you. I think, Caroline, it's the first time. Samir, I remember meeting at a party when you were at Juniper, and Robbie, I used to have your number. You used to phone me up for Daily Politics.
I know, we're
not as close as we used to be. How sad.
I'm very disappointed by that.
But Daily Politics was commissioned by Juniper, I think, was it? So I think
No.
you guys,
the
Sunday
programme you're
Politics,
confusing is when
the
I was
Sunday
running
Politics,
Juniper,
the
I
Daily
made a
Politics.
programme for this
Anyway,
week with Andrew Neil, Michael Patillo,
the
and
Sunday
Diane
version,
Abbott.
that's
And
right.
then-
So you two probably knew each other
and
way back.
Robbie
Okay.
Gibb was the commissioning editor of
At
that.
the BBC, the political programme, I remember, yes. And we all miss your brother. He was a very good schools minister, very responsive. Whenever we had school issues, we'd be up there at the department.
I think I could definitely agree with you.
You are? No. Look, my question. So, Robbie, congratulations on your knighthood. I think that's since we last spoke as well. So, congratulations on that. I guess prior to you taking up the role, your views on the BBC were quite out there in different newspaper articles you wrote. So there's the one from August 2020 in the Telegraph, I think, where you talk about how the BBC needs to get its ship in order. It says that BBC journalists are letting their preferences show. Even any student of impartial, inaccurate press can see this, and it includes a bit of an attack on Lewis Goodall in that article. Then there's a Daily Mail one about the Today programme the same year. Trapped by its own groupthink, it is radio misery, sneering and monstrously out of touch. Do you think that's still the case? That was 2020. You've been on the board since then. Do you still hold those views of the BBC?
Well, the particular issue around Today programme was that during I think it was the 2019 general election, it was unfortunate because I can see how it happened, is that they had outside broadcasts in universities up across, and they had a lot of. Unfortunately, the views expressed were not the views of that story. So the actual debate, that election, the debate was very much in Red Wall, and that created a real problem for them. But I understand why they did it. They wanted to get younger audiences participating. So I don't really see that from anymore in Today programme. They're taking a lot of their output out of central London now into different parts of the country, which is good. In terms of revealed preferences, I feel very, very strongly that you leave your politics at the door, and if you are tweeting, if you take the sum total of people's tweets, you take the sum total of their output, and you know where they're coming from, that is a problem. Because the BBC has to be for everyone. I know lots of BBC journalists. I know their politics because I've been around the BBC a long time. People from very much from the left. They are, you could not tell for one second. And you mentioned Lewis Goodall. I think Lewis Goodall is a very, very talented journalist. So much so, I was the person that recruited him into the BBC in the first place. And on the basis that he came from the IPPR. He was a talented guy, and I wanted to bring people with a diversity of opinion into the BBC. My issues are not particularly focusing on him, is that where people, and that's what I was writing about at the time before I joined the board, where journalists behave in a way which the public know where they're coming from. That is a real problem. One of the things, another credit to Tim Davie and his management of the BBC, introducing some very, very clear guidelines for Twitter, X, and you don't really see those stories anymore. I think the BBC have cracked it.
We've had people like Andrew Neil. I mean, there's always been people, and there's always been political appointments, haven't they? Gavin Davies and, I don't know, James Purnell. Lewis Goodall is still doing podcasts saying that you made his life hell. Why are people saying this? Why is Emily Maitlis writing an article that an active Tory party agent is shaping BBC News output? That's cuddly old you? Why
I
are
think it
people
mentions
saying
my name
these
in that
things?
article, but look, I mean, I don't know why people write that. It's not for me to say, but perception is important, but not as important as reality.
And is it true that, I don't know, we hear there is a culture of fear. We hear there was the all-staff meeting last week. Many people felt very dismissed. Their questions were completely cut. And I think, Samir Shah, you said it was disrespectful of them to raise such issues.
I didn't say it was disrespectful of them. I was doing an all-staff meeting. I know that was dead. What I was trying to say is that, and we talked about...
Sorry, by the way, I should have declared an interest. I was a former staff member at the BBC in the 90s. It was a long time ago, BBC Western
You
House.
mentioned Robbie, and can I just say...
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
That,
So just
and you mentioned that I ran this
painted.
programme called This Week with Andrew Neil and Michael Patillo and Diane Abbott, Rachel, played by Alan Johnson. Every week I spoke to Robbie. He was the head of that department. And not one week did he ever play any politics. If anything, because of Andrew's and Michael's position, he was very keen that the other side, or the Lib Dems, also featured on the sofa. So if there was any push, it was always in the other direction because of the politics of those two. So I have absolute faith in Robbie. Robbie as a journalist, that's my experience of him. Obviously I wasn't involved in his recruitment of the board, but my experience of him was spent many years. So I think it is unfair to say that Robbie comes with, he's principally a journalist. He was a journalist running the whole BBC's political journalism, and he did that with great skill and great commitment to impartiality. That's my view about it. What I was talking about is that people, and I would say that the board of the BBC is full of really extremely experienced, very good people, and I think we should respect them. They're giving their time, they're giving their work on it, and that's what I was talking about. And as a whole, I don't like ad hominem attacks. I think we should look at what they say and the content of what they say, rather than it being a personal ad hominem point. And that's what I was saying. Saying, of course, staff, and people who know me, I go around talking to staff, and as you know, I have monthly lunches with junior staff to hear from them directly what they think of the BBC, and I get a lot of feedback. Staff are absolutely entitled to say what they want to say about me, but I think just in terms of ad hominem attacks, the individuals on my board are good people, they're experienced people, they say wise things, they challenge, as indeed are the executives, and I just want us to respect that.
We need to move on, Rupert, because otherwise we're going to run wildly out of time. Can I just very quickly ask Sir Robbie, there's been a lot of speculation in the media, including BBC journalists, who are saying that what's happened to the BBC over the last couple of weeks was a board-level orchestrated coup, if you like. Can you just address that for me now? You know, do you recognise that characteristic? Was there anything orchestrated about what's happened to the BBC over the last couple of weeks, the departure of Tim Davie, etc.?
It's up there as one of the most ridiculous charges. I mean, people had to find some angle. It's complete nonsense. It's also deeply offensive to fellow board members who are, as Samir was saying, are people of great standing in different fields. The idea that somehow I'm not even sure what the charge is, to be honest, and basically other than to say it's complete nonsense.
Alan?
Yes, I certainly wouldn't have characterised anything I saw in the last couple of weeks as being a board coup.
Or any kind of orchestrated board level?
No, endless debate.
Okay.
but no orchestrated.
Let's go back to Natasha.
Sorry, can I just clarify something? Because you said that you weren't involved with, obviously, so Robbie coming onto the board, but were you involved in helping, also not helping, but what was your role in Dr. Shah becoming chair? Was there any... Nothing? Okay, just clarifying for me to know.
The chair is a public appointment.
Yeah, but I was just wondering, was there any conversations, were your views canvassed in any way? Were you asked your opinion on that?
I mean, when I applied for it, as I obviously know many people in the BBC, I've worked for it, I've been involved in it, and I did canvass, including Robbie and many others, whether they thought it was a good idea. applied for the job or not. I have to say, many thought it was, and I remember one, and I won't quote who it is. He said to me, he's a very senior BBC executive, he said, you know, it's one of those jobs, if you don't get it, you might be rather pleased.
You're feeling that way now.
Well, you know, I knew what he meant.
I was just wondering, just for like process sort of understanding that. So over the weekend we had some reports of a resignation from the board. So Dr. Shah, why did Mr. Banerjee resign from the board?
I'm very pleased you asked me that question. So let me explain to you Sumit Banerjee's role in the board. He is one of our non-executive directors. He's a formidable man with a formidable intellect, and he's contributed enormously in the 4 years he's been on the board. He comes from I believe, a management consultancy, an internationalist commercial view. When its time came up for renewal, which he will be leaving the board in 4 weeks' time, I had a discussion with him in the summer saying that the skills I was looking for over the next few years, especially over charter and funding, were a different set of skills than the ones he possessed, and we would come to an agreement that after 4 years he has contributed extremely well to the BBC debate, but I'll be looking for someone else. Right now, that process of recruiting a new non-executive is underway, and I looked last week at the shortlist, which is a remarkably good, strong shortlist. Caroline is part of it, because she's part of the nominations committee, which I chair, which will recruit this, and I was very heartened by this. So I was, and Sumit was going to leave. The letter came, private letter. The one thing I would say is that what has been picked up is that he was not consulted at that weekend when the resignations of our two most senior people, and there was a discussion. I look back because my memory was that he was. And I can tell the select committee that at 12:47 on that Sunday, I had a 26-minute call with Mr. Banerjee. So that was the weekend in which these things were discussed. I was responding to a request from Tim Davey because this was a very difficult moment. I said it's not a matter for a formal call for the board to discuss whether one of his executives should or should not be there. That's not mine. However, as a good chair, and because of the seriousness of which the events of that weekend, which led, and may I say, to the resignation of two very senior people, this is a very big event. So you would expect me to discuss with NEDs, and I did, all of NEDs over that Saturday and Sunday to hear what they had to say. Included in that discussion was, as I said, a 26-minute call to Mr. Banerjee. I know precisely because of the miracles of smartphone technology, I can scroll back and see it. So I'm both disappointed and surprised at what he had to say. He has a few weeks to run, and all I can say is I'm disappointed by that.
So I suppose if he's only got a few weeks to go to sort of leave now, feels like it's a bit of a statement in itself, the timing of it. So I was just wondering, it's been reported that he's described it as being governance issues at the top of the BBC as one of the reasons that he's decided to leave. Was there any more detail around that?
He said it was a private letter to the board, so I will keep that privacy, but it was leaked in some way because one word came out, and I would simply say he was consulted.
Would we, as a committee, be able to see that letter privately, maybe?
Can I take away that question? I mean, obviously, I want to be as open and as frank with all of you, but it is a private letter, and let me reflect on that and decide how to deal with it.
There was reports today, I believe, in the Eye about a second board member who was on the verge of quitting, and there's also been reports of the role of the EGSC expanding and the creation of a new deputy general role. Dr. Shah, is this not sort of a bit of an admission that perhaps your leadership in this needs to be looked at as well, in terms of whether or not you're able to get a grip of what's happening on that board and if it's all working the way it should do?
You asked a number of questions there. I think on the business of the EGSC and how that should be how that should change. I've asked Caroline to do that, and maybe she can speak to the action she's taking and the answers that she will come up with for the board meeting in December. On your last point, no, I don't think that's right. I think right now my job is to steer the ship out of the shop into an even keel and make sure, and the most important job I have right now is to recruit a Director General. It is far and away the most important thing I need to do.
Would it help I'm a senior independent director, so one of my jobs obviously is to liaise with the other non-exec directors, and I should tell you that Samir has the unanimous support of the board. And that was established at the beginning of what you might call the current crisis, so about a week ago, and was repeated on Friday night. We are very lucky to have him as chairman.
Okay. But there are issues here, aren't there? We're looking now at changing how this all works, and it's taken quite some time to get there. So that was why I asked the question.
Of course, it's completely reasonable. Sorry, completely right question to ask. Sorry, but
and then to wrap up before I think one of my colleagues kind of jump in. So where do we go from here then? What's the next steps for the board?
Well, we are united on the steps that need to be taken. I think, let me put them in three categories. The first is we need to examine the editorial failures and take actions, and part of that is to do with examining. We already know one outcome of that, which I think is very serious, and that's the resignation of our head of news, which I think is, as I repeated, was an important, the right thing to do. She took responsibility. On the governance issue, at the heart of which is the EGSC, Caroline will be coming back to the board with answers. And specifically on the memo that Mr. Prescott wrote, Peter Johnson, one of our head of complaints, will be looking in detail with every single point, asking whether the actions we have taken or actions the management have taken are good enough, and are there more actions to be needed. So that will all come back over the next day. At the same time, I have with my nominations committee and the board, secure a new Director General.
Can I just ask you a very quick question, Dr. Shah? You suggested, in answer to questions to Natasha, that letter from Dr. Banerjee may have leaked, and also we know that the memo leaked. You've got a bit of a problem with leaks in the BBC at the moment. Do you know how did the letter, but also more specifically the memo, how did that find its way to the Telegraph? Have you managed to get to the bottom of that?
I have instituted a leak inquiry. We are a journalistic operation, and it doesn't surprise me that we leak, but these were two very serious leaks. So both, as you heard from Mr. Prescott, he had no intention for it to go out. I don't believe that Mr. Banerjee, in his note, also did not expect to make the news, if I quote him properly. But I do think we should have a leak inquiry, and I've initiated that.
Caroline Thomson, are you a faithful or a traitor?
I was just, there was a wry smile from me, because actually at one level you could say this is a test of what very good journalists we employ, that they manage to get the stories.
Let's move on to Liz, please.
Thank you, Chair. If I can ask Sir Robbie, do you agree with Deborah Turness's statement that recent allegations that the BBC is institutionally biased are wrong?
I do agree with her, yes. And if I could expand, if that's okay. The reason I would never use that, because it implies that all BBC journalists are biased, which I absolutely don't believe that. I mean, you could trot through some, Gary O'Donoghue's fantastic reporting of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, fantastic. Quentin Somerville, and a person, the unsung hero of covering politics, Chris Mason. They're absolutely first rate, and anything that would impeach their impartiality would be wrong. It's also worth noting, with regard to Michael Prescott's memo, there was nothing on BBC Westminster or Millbank, nothing on BBC Northern Ireland, and there's a reason for that, because those particular areas and other areas as well are centres of excellence. They have a lot of scrutiny on a daily basis. They can make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but they correct it very, very quickly. So the reason I agree with Deborah in relation to that, it's we do have some issues, underlying issues in some areas which the BBC have held their hands up to and are addressing, but to tar the entire BBC with that brush would be completely inappropriate.
And were you sorry that Deborah resigned?
I was disappointed that we ended up in this situation, that she ended up resigning. But it's, as a non-exec member, it's not for me to comment on exec members of Tim's team.
There have been 3 resignations in the fallout from the publication of the dossier. There's an argument that if you're a journalist and you were a journalist for over 25 years, the last thing you want is to become the story. Given the reports of your attempts to shape editorial judgments and the persistent questions about whether your political views have influenced BBC decision making, how can the public maintain trust in the BBC's impartiality under your oversight? And in light of these conflicts, have you considered resigning?
There's a lot in that question. If I can, I'll be as brief as I can. I'm a non-exec director. I have no involvement in pre-broadcast content. I have no involvement, and rightly so, in operational matters. There's been lots of stories that are just completely untrue about me in relation to influencing the day-to-day output. In Tim Davies' leaving note, he talked about these issues being weaponised by people. I think he was particularly referring to people that have latched onto the issues in the Prescott memo, the errors, and are using it to bash the BBC. And it's often people who don't agree with the BBC for a whole range of ideological reasons. It's also been politicised in the other way, as a way to have a pop at me. There's something illegitimate, making my role as if I'm not legitimate. Actually, the most people, his response to the memo, who are critical, want the BBC to do better. And I think, so yes, I think it has been weaponised, and I've been the victim of that weaponisation. But broadly speaking, I think most people want the BBC to do well, and parking those two particular extremes. So in answer to your question, no, I don't see, I've not done anything wrong. I'm a passionate defender of the BBC. I'm passionate defender of its values, the licence fee. I was involved in a minor way in helping James Burnell in the last charter renewal. So everything I've done throughout my entire time at the BBC has been to help and to promote the BBC.
You have no intention of resigning?
Correct.
Dr. Shah, as we just heard, Tim Davies said of the BBC, we should champion it, not weaponise it. Do you feel like the BBC is being weaponised?
So I've been involved in the BBC for many decades. I used to work for the BBC when I ran the Current Affairs Department, and then I was on the board, and then I made programmes for it. It is, whenever the BBC makes a mistake, and I think you asked the question, I don't think it's enough to say 99% of the time we get it right. I think when we make a mistake, it's an important thing. We need to identify the problem and take the correct actions. It's not enough to say, well, everything else is great. It's important we hold ourselves to high standards. But when we do make a mistake, what tends to happen, has happened over the years, is that people who want to have a go at the BBC use it to have a go at the BBC. And I said at the beginning here, I apologise for the people who care deeply for the BBC and want it to survive and thrive. And most people do. I do think that when these situations rise, there is a kind of firestorm around it, and people use it as a way of criticising the BBC for the mistake they made. We've always made mistakes, and when we do, the right thing to do is to own up to it, fix it, and to your point, act quickly. I think one of the things I'm going to learn from these 3 weeks is we do need to find out and examine why does it take so long. I don't think there's any malice here in taking long, and I don't think it is about a sclerotic organisation. I think, but we do need to understand why it takes so long and try and fix that as well. It's important we do, because the longer it takes, the more it becomes a political football to be kicked around with. So it is, to me, one of the lessons there. Editorial, their governance, and then there's this issue of speed of response. It's an important thing. It matters that we are just quicker and get on the front foot.
Thanks, Liz. Dr. Sharp, your colleague, Sir Robbie, is coming for quite a lot of stick in the media, as you're probably aware, for somehow wielding his right-wing bias to influence the board, albeit, I mean, looking at the recent YouGov figures, it shows that 31% of people think the BBC is biased in favour of left-wing views, compared to 19% who think it's biased.
31% in favour of left-wing views?
Yes, 31% say it's biased in favour of left-wing views, 19% in favour of right-wing views, and the number that think it's in favour of left-wing views is actually going up. So if he is wielding his right-wing bias, he's not doing it very well. But leave that to one side. What's your view? Is Sir Robbie overly politically biased in his discussions with the board?
No, he's not. And my account of my dealings with Robbie when he was my commissioner, he's interested in impartiality and accuracy. And I do think that when he brings to the table, and he feels very strongly about it, the stories, the issues he raises, look at the substance of it. The substance of it is about being accurate and fair. Not often discussed, and maybe Sir Robbie will talk about it himself. There was an issue about a rail strike where, Robbie, why don't you explain that?
Yeah, so I am, conscious of, the perception of my bias. I'm always on the lookout for biases the other way to make sure that I can, demonstrate what I say. And I saw a story before last Christmas. It was a train strike, and the whole story, it was a regional journalist. It was the whole notion of the train strike was how inconvenient it was to passengers, and it was very, very dismissive, verging on the critical of the union striking. And so I spotted this. It clearly, from my perspective, lacked the union voice, either in tracking or in clip. I raised it, sent it to the head of BBC England and copied in EGSC, and it was agreed that was the case. And the journalist was spoken to, and he totally agreed, and that was good. One of the sorry.
No.
Are you responsible then in that case for the fact that YouGov found that 31% of people feel that the BBC is biased in favour of left-wing views?
So, look, I mean, this is the thing. I know it's hard to marry the fact that I spent 2 years as a director of communications for the government, not the Conservative, the government, and my genuine passion for impartiality. I want to hear the full range of views. I mentioned the recruiting of Lewis Goodall. I don't want the BBC to be partisan or favour any particular way. When you tune in, I want to know what is happening.
Can I begin to let me answer that question. I don't think that the way we address our issues are helpfully characterised as left-wing or right-wing. We examine things. Say, for example, which was not mentioned, we cover business coverage or the migration report, and there are issues we find that we're strong in some cases and we need to get better in others. I think the question is about, are we impartial? Are we covering all sides of the argument? Are we making sure that we are not showing any revealed preferences? That's what it's about. I think, I just don't think of it. Is this a left-wing position? Take, for example, our discussion, as we do, which is a very important, in this time frame, the January to May, every 5 years, the BBC reviews its editorial guidelines. It's the most important document we have to make sure that every 5 years, it came to the editorial, the EGSC, for rigorous examination. It then goes normal process to the board. We did that with great, and people discussed it. Even we discussed what is our position on the use of the word terrorist. So it's not just a simple, let's pass it. These are really important questions. These were debated. It was, again, a very strong, very helpful, very constructive debate. And that's how it works. I like differences of opinion. I like diversity of opinion. The worst thing for us is to have groupthink. We want to challenge, we want to... That's what's important. And it's important we have points of view representing, frankly, the country as a whole.
Okay, cool. Rupert?
Yeah, I don't think it's just the 2 years at the Conservative Party, though, is it? Did you not work on the Portillo leadership campaign? Because I think what's interesting is you've gone in and out, back and forth, whereas other people usually make the break, go to one or the other.
Sure, but I spent 25 years at the BBC. That's the important thing. I have been defined by these 2 years in Number 10.
You have also worked.
I have worked for the Conservative Party.
The Portillo campaign. You worked for Francis Maud. So it's not just 2 years isolated.
No, but my point.
Anyway, look, that's. Oh, sorry.
But just for clarity, I was talking about how I've been defined. I'm not saying I haven't had any other political involvement in my history. I am 61, so there's a lot of time to fill.
So the EGSC, just wanted to ask, it's got a few holes in it now, right? Because of these resignations.
No, it's the board.
Oh, is this to me?
EGSC, or whoever wants to answer the EGSC question.
Mr. Banerjee was not a member of the EGSC, he was a member of the board.
But,
and there's no hole there because
the two, Tim Davey and Deborah Tyner's were.
Yeah. Well, that will be part of course, Caroline's examination of the composition of the EGSC. So maybe you would like to speak to that.
For the moment, Tim Davey is still Director General, so he would still be a member of the EGSC and come to the meetings. Jonathan Munro is the acting Director of News, so he will come in replacement for Deborah. Okay. So we don't have holes at the moment, but what the Chairman has asked me to do is do a root and branch review of EGSC, which I'm doing at speed and at pace at the moment, and one of the things we will look at is the membership.
It does seem a very small number of people to be arbiter of editorial standards, and including someone who is known for their conservative past and being a bit partisan. I just wondered, I've seen the minutes of the 6th of March 2025, and there's actually an agenda item. Actually, it deals with the BBC Arabic issue, so I do agree with what was said by you, Samir Shah, in your letter, that some of the things in the Prescott memo were dealt with, so I don't know why they're in there still making hay, including BBC Arabic. However, plan for reform voters.
And for
reform voters. So there's a whole item in there about how there needs to be trust built with the reform electorate. Is there not going to be something similar planned for green voters? Those are going up as well in opinion polls. It does seem very slanted when you look at panel shows that there always seems to be Zia Youssef on it or Nigel Farage. This is a party with 4 MPs.
Yeah.
Why plan?
I'm happy to.
I'm happy to take it. But Robbie, why don't you start? And I'll come in on it.
So there's 2 issues there, both of great interest. So that particular meeting, Deborah Tyner did a presentation on party support for the BBC, and it was a discussion by voting. There's a number of things, but then Labour very, very supportive, and then there was concern about why is it that reform voters didn't support. They had, hostility to the BBC, and she had various thoughts that was absolutely not about doing stories that are favourable to reform, because that's how it could come across. One of her ideas was having more live discussion programmes in all. So that was what that was about. You look sceptical. So that was that. The second issue is something that's very close to my heart. Is the issue about allocation of airtime to different political parties, and there's a general sort of metrics for doing it, is that you look at past and present levels of support over 2 electoral cycles as making a judgment. And the particular problem at the moment, of course, is that you've got, for example, Reform leading in the polls, but very, very few seats. You've got Liberal Democrats further down the poll with many more seats. You've got the Greens, as you pointed out, in second in some polls. And you've got the government, in a much lower percentage, but they are the government, and you've got the leader, the official opposition struggling on but less than 20%, but still the official opposition. It is the exec are massively alert to this, and we have updates at every EGSC on this very, very subject.
May I answer that? And let me step back a bit. One of the jobs of the BBC and its news division is to reflect the points of view across the country, that we are properly impartial, and we hear that. In establishing where we may be weak or where we are strong, we do a lot of research. We do a lot of research on various demographics. We want to, for example, we need to make sure levels of trust are just as high amongst young people as it is amongst old people. And this is normal business. We look at how the country responds and to trusting the BBC.
Just the reform voters, why not?
And what we discovered when we did the political analysis, it's among lots of, we do demographic analysis, we do geographic analysis. One of the things about geography, which I'm very exercised by, is that support for the BBC declines as you go further north. This is a very, very big issue for the BBC. We are across the country, and it's made one of my strategic priorities is we've moved programmes and production out, we need to move power out of London, and that will help establish better trust as we go further north. So it's not surprising that the news division examines itself.
It is surprising to the millions of licence fee payers that reform seems to be on so frequently. There's a plan for reform voters. There doesn't seem to be a plan for other parties that are rising.
For how to reach young people, and how do we do that? And that's not just about content, it's also about the platforms.
It's over some of the ones I asked Michael Prescott, just to get the other side of it. Was there any discussion of the dossier with him before, or even the appointment at all?
What?
Yeah, with yourself, because you're friends, we've established now.
I don't think I had any conversation. I know him, and I've got to know him a lot better since he's joined, but there was no conversation with him prior to his appointment. And in terms of the only contact I had with him, I've not met him in person since Sorry, go on.
Yeah, in the run-up to the job. I think I asked him in the run-up to being appointed.
Nothing run-up to the job
and
at all.
Since the dossier.
Nothing in the run-up to the job. It's quite a long time ago, but I'm 99% certain that no contact. And in relation to the dossier, I phoned him about a week, coincidentally, prior to him sending his dossier, just checking in. I hadn't seen him or spoken to him since while I was walking along. And he actually asked me, or he told me he was thinking of sending a note to Samir as chair about his concerns about his time on EGSC, and did I think it was a good idea? And I thought, well, fair enough. If you want to do that, that's fair enough. But then I think I then phoned you, Samir, and mentioned this to you, if you recall, and I think to check how it arrived. And the next thing I found was this whole dossier in my inbox as a member of the board. So something happened between him saying to me he was thinking of writing to Samir as chair, and him deciding to send to the whole board.
And just lastly, I mean, some of the things in there, the Gaza coverage, for example, it would have surprised many that he saw the BBC position as what it was, because we get email, and again, Tim Davey in that chair used to always say we get complaints from both sides. So, again, has the EGSC ever considered the Centre for Media Monitoring report? That was a 188-page systematic look at every mention of Gaza, and I think they found that the equivalent number of deaths, IDF death, did not amounted to many thousands of Gazan deaths. I just wondered, I mean, because his thing seems so partial, and I don't think he really allayed that fear that it was all from one perspective. Would the EGSC ever consider left-wing type perspectives?
We've never looked at other people's reports in that sense. What we would do is look at particular concerns about accuracy, particularly. I've been interested. You've said quite a lot of
poverty or climate change, or any of
so you have raised an issue which I was interested in, about the dehumanising way in which the language used, I think I'm right in saying, for about Palestinian casualties, and issues around the reporting of how we describe Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that's interesting in terms of the language used for the Palestinian casualties, which I think I'm not unsympathetic to what you're saying. There's a type of research that you use called sentiment analysis, which uses AI to make a proper assessment. And what I would say is that it's definitely the kind of thing I would like to see us digging quite deeply into when we do the thematic review into the Middle East. The trouble with that type of analysis, it's not very well respected and regarded, and so it's much easier and more pressing to do things about accuracy where you can really nail it. But I mean, you get me wrong. I am sympathetic to you in relation to those concerns being addressed.
I would say listen to your staff more, all those all staff meetings, all those letters with 400 signatories, not just one person every time.
Thank you, Rupert. Let's have Damien, please.
Thank you, Caroline. Dr. Shah, you came back a few moments ago to what I think is a central issue here, which is the speed of response. So I'm old enough to remember 2007, before your time leading the organisation, but when the BBC was in hot water over the misnaming of a kitten.
Oh, yes.
You do get held to a higher standard. That comes with the privilege of the licence fee. But on that occasion, it also took over a year and a leak for it to come out. So it's kind of all very well to say, well, we must just do better at coming out faster. But what is going to make the BBC face up and fess up faster?
I think that's such an important question. And I understand the scepticism that it always seems to take time. I don't know the answer to your question, but I'm heartened by one other area. It's a parallel area which I was involved in. I took very great care to accept, which was what we call the culture review, where in my first year I was determined to tackle abuses of power. And there was a lot of we do this year in, year out, it's always happened. And there was some skepticism. But in the event, we did a very strong review. We came out earlier this year with, and I and the board, but I took personal ownership of trying to get this right in the face of skepticism. And I would say that the executive responded extremely well. There's a very serious set of actions that are in place now to tackle it. So, whilst I agree...
I'm going to have to rush you.
No, but what I would say is that I think I will equally, once I focus on it, say, what is the problem here? Why do we not come out more quickly? What is it that stops us, and how can we fix it? It's going to be absolutely one of the lessons I've learned of this particular 3 weeks. I do hear your skepticism because, you know, I remember that kitten story.
Socks, in case you're just delving deep. Socks and cookie.
Yeah. And so I think it's important, and I think it is a constant problem for the BBC that we do respond in a way that always puts us on the back foot. And I don't like that. I want us to be on the front foot and get out our statements clearly. If we made a mistake, hold our hands up fast. If we don't think it's a mistake, say that.
So returning to the backward-looking thinking,
Yes.
so what is in the Prescott memo? So the board is committed to revisit everything that's in that memo and to report back on them, on those items transparently about your conclusions. What does that mean in practice, and what is the transparency we should be looking out for?
Well, what I've asked Peter Johnson to do is to examine every single story and set out what actions we've taken, or the executive have taken, to deal with that. Then analyse whether those actions are adequate and whether more actions need to be taken. So be very precise to every single point. It may be that we'll find, for example, in my view, about the insurance thing, the action was taken and that's it, and we don't need to do any more. But there will be others where we think, Peter Johnson may think, well, these are the actions taken, A, B, C, but we now need to do D and E as well. So it's going to be very precise, and we're going to...
Earlier this afternoon, Mr. Prescott said to us that you should treat all the issues he's raised as systemic unless and until they are demonstrated to be otherwise. Do you think that is a correct way to go about that analysis that you're talking about?
Well, I should say I'm not clear what Mr. Prescott means by the word systemic.
Let me put, he's not here for me to put words in his mouth
but tell me.
In present, but I think what he means is, rather than saying it was a one-off, something went wrong on that Tuesday in March, somebody made an error, that there's something in the organisation, whether it's in the culture, the systems, the processes. I think that's probably what he means by systemic.
Let me talk about how I read those series of points that Mr. Prescott.
You do it concisely.
Yes, okay. So I think there were some individual errors, but I also think it points to some underlying problems. That's how I would describe them. For example, an underlying problem in the Arabic service.
Forgive me, so the question is, do you think it's a reasonable approach to this exercise that is about to be undertaken to start with the assumption that for each of those items it may have been systemic. We have to demonstrate it's not.
I wouldn't frame it in that way. I would ask Peter Johnson to look at each one on its own merits and examine. He's a very fine, very seasoned and experienced journalist, to look at each one and come to the board with an analysis of whether this is an individual error or a underlying problem error or it's a systemic error.
Thank you. And just finally from me, Sir Robbie, could you just say to the committee what you think it should be the future for the BBC, what role it should play in the next 10 years, which may be the same or different from in the past 10 or 20 or 30 years?
A nice open question. One of the things I do agree with Michael Prescott is the potential for the BBC. You know, in the world of totally dividing channels from Fox to and all the rest of it and the internet, we have a brand, we have a DNA that could actually just lead the way, not just in the UK but globally. That is the thing I find most exciting. I think we've still got a huge opportunity to do that. And so in 10 years, yeah, I think that we could do that in 10 years.
Thank you, Damien. Bio, please.
Thank you. Just on that last point, in the previous panel, Michael Prescott, you mentioned that he called you and sort of ran it by you effectively with regards to...
No, I called him this is before
regarding the memo.
Yeah, I called him a week prior, so it wasn't that way round.
Okay.
Just checking in because I'd not spoken to him since he left.
Yeah.
And in that he said he was thinking about, or had done, I couldn't quite remember, message the chairman. That was it wasn't anything else about the memo.
Okay. And so do you sort of feel from that question he felt that it could be damaging to the organisation? The fact that he checked.
He didn't check. I phoned him and he said, he's thinking of sending a memo.
But you phoned him, but he brought up the issue that he was going to send it.
Yeah, because that was our primary connection was via the EGSC, and it was not an reason. He must have just been writing his memo then. That's all I can assume. It was a very, very fleeting.
But when you called him, did you know he was going to be preparing this memo?
No, not at all. No, I phoned him to check in. I hadn't spoken to him since he had left the EGSC as an advisor. He must just crossed my mind.
So he brought it up. I mean, look, I say this obviously because, you know, there's an element of perception the chair was talking about earlier as well. I think that, you know, there is a scenario where, I mean, imagine if Keir Starmer sort of recruited Alistair Campbell. There is that perception that is important here, and so that's why we're asking some of the questions that we're asking.
I totally get, and I hope I was trying to make the distinction between. Well, first, I was never as good a communications person as Alistair Campbell, but I only did it for 2 years.
That was good. All right.
But I did, unlike him, I did 25 years as a BBC journalist. So my whole DNA is very different to his. I'm an impartial BBC journalist, not a spin doctor by nature.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is, has the experience of Mr. Prescott's memo where he felt the EGSC was not acting, so he escalated to the BBC board and altered your thinking on how the EGSC interacts with the board. So what do you want the SOAR review to achieve?
Would you like me to...
Actually, no.
So the review I'm doing is I've been given carte blanche by the chairman to really look root and branch at how EGSC is operating. I think what EGSC as it currently operates has many strengths. You've heard us mention, for example, the thematic reviews have been really useful. But it's perhaps turned a bit into a bit too much of a debating chamber as opposed to probably needing something that's more akin to an audit function. So something that's more into tracking actions. I think this is a point that will resonate with some of the conversation we've been having today with you. Looking at the organiser of it, should they have a dotted line to the chair, the non-exec chair, so that you have a line of accountability there. And also the other thing that would resonate with what we've been discussing this afternoon is the way that the EGSC reports to the main board. I think one of the conclusions we're reaching is that, for example, on the Arabic service, one of the problems was a lot of action was taken, but no one communicated the action. So the EGSC didn't know and the board didn't know. And actually tracking through actions properly so we can check they've happened, but also making sure that everyone knows they've happened and can see the results is one of the important things we'll probably do.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. This question is to yourself, Dr. Shah. The EGSC used to be chaired by Nicholas Sirota, who was the Senior Independent Director. Why is the chair of the BBC board chairing the EGSC?
Yes, I think the issue of whether I, as the chair of the board, should also chair the EGSC is one that I would like Caroline to examine. As I said, nothing is off the table here. I think it's important we get this right, and I'm perfectly happy to take what recommendations she makes to the board and the board's outcomes of those recommendations. And being the chair of the EGSC will be part of that.
Okay, and I know that you've mentioned that you're looking to change the composition as well of the EGSC. So what will it look like?
Maybe Caroline should... I think
it will still have a mix of execs and non-execs, I think. I mean, I should say I'm speculating to you before I've been to the board with the conclusions. So, they may, subject to the board agreeing them. I think it should have a broad representation of views as far as possible from within that. And we should still have independent advisors. But we might look at the role and how we define the job descriptions of the independent advisors. The two independent advisors you've seen today have their contracts already finished, so we need to reappoint them.
My final question to Dr. Shah. Were board members excluded from conversations on the Director General going?
On the Director General going?
Yes.
I don't exclude board members. I mean, you're talking about that weekend, where I spent the weekend talking to every single NED about the situation, and I wanted to hear what they had to say. When we had a board meeting in the late Sunday afternoon, the Director of News had resigned, and the Director General resigned. So we didn't have a board meeting to discuss. Well, first of all, it is not our position to discuss whether or not an executive working for the Director General is a matter for the board. It is not. It's a matter for the Director General.
Actually, just before you carry on with your answer, I say that because as the chair, there's a strong relationship that you have with the DG, yes, Director General. And so there's an element of protecting and supporting the Director General. So what I'm trying to get at is what happened there in terms of protection of a relationship that's very strong that obviously failed.
Yes. Let me repeat. I think that Director General Tim Davey has done an outstanding job as Director General, and I'm very sorry to lose him. Let me be clear. And it's not just me, the whole board, and I know that because I've spoken to them all, one-to-one, that he had the full confidence of the board and they wanted him to continue. No question. Tim knew that, and in his resignation, you will see his reasons for resigning, but I'll make it absolutely clear that neither I as chair or the board wanted him to go. He had our full confidence, and we would have liked him to stay.
Okay, with him going, did you think about your position?
My position? Yeah. My job now is to steady the ship and put it on an even keel. I'm not somebody who walks away from a problem. I think my job is now to fix it, and that's what I'm doing. And I want to lead the organisation in such a way to address the issues we've raised, which are editorial, governance, and the issue of speed, and to fix that and lead what is really important here, the search for a new Director General.
Thank you.
Dr. Shah, there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks all across the media as to whether actually the job of a DG is just too big for one person to do and whether that role should be split down. Now, before you'll have seen we spoke to Michael and Caroline. They both thought that it was and that it should be split. They had different views about how that should happen. Michael thought that it should be an editor-in-chief alongside a sort of chief executive in a business sense, if you like, whereas Caroline thought there should be the other Caroline thought there should be a Director General and then a Deputy Director General. And that's been what's been reported in The Guardian, suggesting that might happen. Have you got a preference in that sense? Do you think the job's too big for one person? Should it be split down? How should it be split?
It's a very important question, and my view is that it is too big for one person. My view is that as we search for the new Director General, in that lens by which we search for that Director General, I should make it clear, and the Nominations Committee should make it clear, that there should be a Deputy Director General who's laser focused on journalism. Journalism is the most important thing and our greatest vulnerability. And I remember when I first started, I think it was mentioned, when I first started as Head of Current Affairs, John Bird was Deputy Director General and his focus was journalism. That did not mean that the DG was not Editor-in-Chief. We mentioned later on, more recently, Mark Thomson was the Director General. He was also the Editor-in-Chief. And even though Mark Thomson was a journalist by trade, he still felt the need to have a Deputy Director General, Mark Byford, in charge of journalism. That was then. Now, it seems to me it's even more important because the nature of news has changed. The importance, that, as Robbie mentioned, that this is an opportunity. The BBC needs to be the beacon of impartial journalism. It absolutely does. We are living in a world in the next 10 years where people need to trust us and we need to have a focus that our journalism is good. And I think that needs that. So I'm inclined to restructure the executive in the future, once we get a new director, that the lens through which we examine potential candidates for the Director General includes the idea that there will be a Deputy Director General who will be focused on journalism.
Thank you, Damien.
Having a Director General and a Deputy Director General, the hierarchy couldn't be clearer. Did you think about doing it a different way, where you have a Chief Executive who runs the organisation and a, whatever you call them, Editor-in-Chief, who is ultimately accountable for content, and they both report into the board?
I think that's an interesting observation, but obviously the Charter at the moment does not allow that. In the Charter, the Director General...
It's going to get renewed quite soon.
Well, I think, as I said, it's a good moment for discussion, but right now, I have to replace the Director General, right now. And I have to replace it within the terms of the Charter. And the Charter allows that. I think the point you raise is worth raising, and we, as with many issues, we will be talking about the Charter. There are many factors about the Charter that we need to discuss and engage in, and we need to start that conversation.
Well, here you are in Parliament. It is an opportunity to express your views in any way you like. Well, so you're constrained by the current Charter. Were you unconstrained, would you take a different view?
Well, right now, my view, and I recall that the Chair would like me to take a position, I think that the idea of a DG and a DDG has worked well, and I can see it working again. I will need to be persuaded that the alternative one is a better solution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Jeff.
Okay, thanks. That's the executive. Can we talk briefly about the board? So what do you want to do about changing the composition of the board? Particularly, would you want to change the number of non-exec board members?
Well, again, a matter for a Charter, and I've already said I'm looking forward to some constitutional innovation about the board. By that, I mean, I think we do need to take a look at the composition of the board, the flexibility there is, in the nature of the public appointments, how many public appointments there are. All of it should be a matter for discussion.
Do you have a view?
I do have a view. I would like, as the Chair, to have greater flexibility. At the moment, I have 10 non-execs and 4 execs. 14, that's it, rigid. And given the state of the way the world is changing and the kind of skills and experiences we need on the board, I would like greater flexibility to reshape the board to make it better able with the experiences to the world that's coming forward. We talked earlier about the impact of AI on journalism and the whole point about AI. If it's important now, can you imagine how important it'll be in 5 years' time? If I find that the board does not have enough expertise in that area, I'd like to be able to change that.
Okay, and can I ask about political appointees? Do you think it's right that do you think it's important to have political appointees to the board? Can I ask all three of you that question, actually?
Well, I'm sorry, what did you say at the end?
Well, is it important? Is it right for there to be political appointees?
Let me be clear, they're public appointments, not political appointments. Just be clear, there's a process.
About politicians.
You apply. And I think we should look at this. I think it's important. And the issue here for me is independence versus accountability. We need to be independent, but it's also important that we are accountable to the public, to Parliament, and the nations. The 4 public appointments are to the 4 nations. England, I don't need to spell them out. I think it's important the nations are represented on the board of the BBC. How that mechanic is, I think we can discuss it and we should make it clear.
Could those nations be the contributions be provided by somebody with journalistic experience, not appointed by the government?
I'm sorry, what, of the nations?
Yeah.
Well, I've given you my point about the executive. I think the Deputy Director General should be there. I think journalism is a good skill to have, but there are many things. The BBC is a very, very big organisation, does many, many things. And I think whilst journalism is a very important part, my vision of that is that the DDG, who will be on the board, will be focused on that. The 10 non-executives, it needs to be accountable as well as independent. So I do see a role for people who represent the nations, because that's part of it. But how that happens, we can discuss it. And of course, as you know, I've left out the other public appointment, that is the chair, and I think the chair should be in that mix as well.
Thank you very much. Can I ask just one question on that? When you appeared in front of our predecessor committee,
yes,
at your pre-appointment hearing, you were asked whether you felt that it was acceptable that members of your board should be permitted to be members of a political party, and at that point you weren't able to give us a definitive answer. You weren't sure. Do you know now?
The answer is you can be a member of a political party. As it happens, Sir Robbie was not, is not. We've had many people, even the chair, we will remember, was a member. Sometimes politicians are, and they're members of parties. The real thing is to have diversity of opinion, and there are party politics are left out. And we examine the point of it.
Just a super quick follow-up, not opinion one, but just on, if we're reforming the board, is there not an argument for having staff appointments on there? Because if you look at AFP in France and NPR, a number of those positions are reserved for, Robbie, you've done journalism, but I think your current board, if you look at it, it looks like it could be the post office board. There's a lot of people from business. So people who've made those hardened decisions, maybe even the foreign correspondents who've had to make quick decisions when, you know, people are trying to weaponise things. Some of those people would be good on your board, some actual staff. What do you think?
You make a very, very good point. I was hoping, because of events, I haven't been able to make a speech about the BBC and its accountability and how we can make it more accountable. We have mechanisms to be accountable, as this is to Parliament, to the government today, but I'm concerned about how accountable we are to the public and the licence fee payer.
Also, having a board,
and
do you know what I mean, of people who've done it.
Part of that accountability is, again, to do with the membership of the main board.
And last but not least, Vicky.
We all know that staff morale is really important. So how does the board assess current levels of staff confidence in the BBC leadership, given leadership transitions and the charter review? And then on that point, do we know when the charter renewal may be taking place? And will it potentially have to wait until the Director General is appointed?
Your last question, no. What's happening is that we're waiting, and we expect it to be imminent, the publication of the Green Paper. The Green Paper will be the government's attempt to secure consultation. And between the Green Paper and the White Paper, which will be their outcome, what they plan to do, we will be in heavy conversations and discussions about the Charter, about the purpose of the BBC, about the way it's regulated, about the composition of the board, all the issues, and fundamentally what the mission is. We then also have a parallel discussion: how do we fund that? The funding model will be another major. That will continue. Tim Davie is the Director General of the BBC, and he's helping us through that. He will continue to do that. So that cannot be paused awaiting the arrival of a new Director General. This is a matter of some urgency. We are in debate, we'll discuss it, we'll do that. On the matter of staff morale, I think this is a very, very important part. We have a very continuous measurement of staff morale. It's a very detailed look, and we're always looking at it. It is, as I said right at the beginning, you know, the events that have come recently has been something that I deeply regret, and it has had an impact, of course, on the thousands of people. So we will be measuring that and trying to make sure that we include them in as we develop our arguments.
Yeah, just briefly, what is the thing for measuring staff morale?
Metric for measuring it.
But how do you do it? Like what happens to measure it?
Well, we have we go through effectively what you'd call a survey, a staff survey, and it's reported every year in our annual report. We do a comprehensive staff survey, and we do it in all sorts of different parts, so we can break it down, we can see where morale is, and not just morale, but loads of other factors. I can send you, if you would like, the detail of how we measure how the staff are thinking in a systematic, comprehensive way. But as you say, I also talk to staff, I have regular lunches with them, so I get a more anecdotal approach to it. But it's important that I actually meet staff and I see them face to face and not just numbers on a sheet. But we do have numbers on a sheet, and we do it very comprehensively, and we report it in the annual report.
Actually, not quite, because the question was about how they feel in terms of confidence in terms of the BBC leadership. Is that one of your questions within the survey?
It is a question that's going on. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear yet. Everything is asked.
Thank you, Vicky. Just finally, in terms of penultimately, in terms of staff morale, in 2023 the BBC had 8 equal pay cases open. Last year, our predecessor committee was told that there were 11, so it went up between 2023 and 2024. Do you know how many there are now?
I do not, but I can get you the figures.
If I was to tell you that I'd heard that there were 40 equal pay
40.
cases. Yes, that's what's being reported to us. I would really be very grateful if you could look into that and come back.
I will look into that and find out what the reasons for that increase
and
is.
if in fact that figure is
correct. If that is the figure.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. And then finally, the BBC shared in confidence with us the initial response to Mr Prescott's memo by Peter Johnson, which is the one that the board commissioned. Did you consider publishing that
report?
Yeah.
I didn't consider publishing it. It was important for me when the board discussed Mr Prescott's memo that they had a full and rounded picture of what did take place over the 3 years. You have challenged Mr Prescott on his selection. I think it was important when the board discussed it, they had a proper picture of all the different things we did consider and the actions we did take.
So would you be happy for us to publish that response?
Can I come back to you on that, because it was a private note?
Yes.
For the board, and
we think that it's quite helpful in setting out all the issues and
indeed,
going through
it
them
would,
one by one.
And I think I will reflect on that and try and look at it positively, because I think it slightly goes back to your point about speed. We do this work quite quickly. I asked for it to be done straight away because we were having a board meeting. We had the response, but we kept it to ourselves. And to me, it becomes part of this examination. What lessons can we learn about this? We've done it, but also about the speed of action and what we can do and how we can publish more, be more transparent, so we're not on the back foot. And we need to understand the world we live in, and that if we don't get out on the front foot, then they will fill that vacuum with whatever they want to say. I think it's a really important point.
With that pace in mind, could you let us know quickly?
I will let you know, great pace.
And also whether you're going to be publishing the new Peter Johnson report that you mentioned in response to Damien's questions as well. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you all of you for appearing in front of us today. Is there any further messages that you want to leave us with?
No, I think that's
you've had enough. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone for your time today. Order.